Chapter 525. The moon was as cold as water. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant foot of the mountain and the distant seaside. He saw the small boat gently sinking and floating in the ink-like water. His internal strength was tyrannical and his eyesight was astonishing. He still could not clearly see the situation on the boat. Strangely, it was as if he could see the old man on the boat, that straw hat, and that wisp of beard from so far away. Of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, he had only seen Yi Luyun. Once when he was young and once in Suzhou. Each time he was stunning. Yi Luyun was a free and easy person, a very free and easy person. Tonight, he had come riding a boat through the waves with a sword in hand. His aura had not yet arrived, but his elegance was already enough to make one's heart tremble. Fan Xian looked at the boat in the ocean and thought of the great grandmaster who had floated alone on the boat and charged toward Dong Mountain. Even though there were thousands of people in front of him, he couldn't help but feel deeply moved. A glimmer of respect grew in his heart for no reason. The small boat appeared close but was actually very far. It bathed in the moonlight on the shore of an antenna and slowly moved toward this side. It was as if it would never get close to this shore. Fan Xian knew that the furthest distance in the world was not the distance between life and death. Thus, this small boat, which was about to determine the life and death of countless people, would eventually reach the shore. At the foot of the mountain, on the side facing away from the shore, dots of fire suddenly appeared. Although they were dots of fire, the light was enough to reach the summit of the mountain. It could be imagined that on the battlefield there, powerful rebel soldiers had appeared like ghosts and were desperately attacking the line of defense of the imperial army. The power of the fire when they burned the camp had already grown to an uncontrollable level. Fortunately, there was a lot of rain in the summer. Additionally, the sea wind blew and the mountain was very humid. There was no need to worry that this fire would directly burn Dong Mountain into a charred pillar and burn everyone on the mountain to death. A few more mournful signal arrows shot into the sky. They only reached halfway up the mountain before falling miserably and dispiritedly and powerlessly. It was at this time that the Imperial Army's line of defense at the foot of the mountain found it difficult to continue and almost couldn't hold out much longer. The little boat had not yet arrived, but the powerful enemies had already reached the foot of the mountain. The Qing Emperor and his group all had their backs to the sea. Standing in front of the stone railings for viewing the scenery, they silently watched the activity at the foot of the mountain, watched the fires that burned and died, and listened to the faint sounds of killing. However, they were still too far away. When the sounds of battle reached the peak of the mountain, they were blown by the wind and rustled by the branches of the trees. It actually became a somewhat distorted rhythmic beat. There was no killing intent. At least, the people on the summit of the mountain did not feel this kind of atmosphere. In comparison, the little boat slowly drifting over from the ocean behind Dong Mountain brought more nervousness to the people. At this time, the minister of the Board of Rites, the officials of Taichung Temple, and the other officials who had come to worship heaven had long walked out of their rooms and followed behind the silent emperor. Each of them was shocked and terrified, but no one dared to say anything. The deputy commander of the Imperial Army had long charged down the mountain, prepared to fight to the death on the front line. However, before he arrived, the 2,000 soldiers of the Imperial Army would probably have already become wandering spirits in the night and corpses in the mountains. Fan Xian felt a slight bitterness in his mouth. He unconsciously stuck out his tongue to lick his dry lips. A glimmer of shock grew uncontrollably in his heart. Where did this army at the foot of the mountain come from? Why didn't the Overwatch Council's network on Shandong Road detect anything ahead of time? Why didn't the 500 Black Knights placed in the Shao Mountain area have any effect? Was the other party able to sneak to the foot of Dong Mountain without anyone noticing? What shocked him the most was the situation at the foot of the mountain. Seeing the flames retreating, listening to the rise and fall of the sounds of killing, and judging from the signal arrows, he knew that the Imperial Army could no longer hold out. The 2,000 Imperial soldiers were about to be defeated so quickly. Although the Imperial Army was stationed in Jingdo and could not compare to the Dingzhou Army, Northern Expedition Camp, and the 7 Roads of Armies in terms of field battle ability, ever since the Great Prince had been transferred to the position of commander of the Imperial Army, he had transferred many key generals from the original Western Expedition Army. The Imperial Army's strength had been effectively replenished. Even if they were not a match for those armies, they would not be defeated so quickly. After Fan Xian was shocked, a glimmer of confusion welled up in his heart. Whose family did the attacking army belong to? It's Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp. The emperor stood by the stone railing and looked in the direction of the foot of the mountain. Although it was clear that he could not see clearly what was happening below, he saw a glimmer of unease in Fan Xian and old Eunuch Hong's eyes. Coldly he said, The imperial army is not a match for them. Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He immediately thought of the strange Cangzhou victory between Cangzhou and Yanjing a month ago. Although he still didn't know what method Yan Xiaoyi had used to send these soldiers to the foot of Dong Mountain, since the enemy had already arrived, thinking about it now was a waste of time. You are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. An army has traveled thousands of li to carry out an attack deep inside the country. What crime is that? The emperor looked at Fan Xian and asked with a slight smile. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He knew that the emperor was joking. However, the situation at the foot of the mountain was so dangerous. He was not in the mood to joke. He replied, even if there is a secret passage to the north of Danzhou, the Overwatch Council should have received news of it. Thus, I think that someone in the council is helping him. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. There was an additional glimmer of self-mockery in his smile. Fan Xian saying that there was a problem in the council was honest and also a test. He wanted to test whether or not the elite group at the foot of the mountain, killing like tigers and wolves, Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp, had been purposely let there by the emperor. Looking at the emperor's confident expression and calm posture, Fan Xian believed this deduction in the depths of his heart. However, the emperor's smile appeared very helpless. I want to know the specific situation at the foot of the mountain, the emperor suddenly said coldly. I don't want to be blind. Back then the emperor had personally led the army to fight north and south. He had made illustrious achievements in battle and could be called the foremost general in the land. However, he had not personally gone into battle for almost 20 years. That was why Shang Shanhu, who was fighting the barbarians in northern Qi, had gradually overshadowed the monarch's military glory. In the situation of the royal entourage being surrounded, if the emperor could personally command the imperial army, presumably, the imperial army at the foot of the mountain would not have been defeated so wretchedly. However, even though there was a bright moon hanging high in the night, going up and down the mountain was not as joyful as singing folk songs. Sending orders took a long time, much less personally commanding. Thus, the emperor's expression was icy and his tone was not friendly. This slight unfriendliness did not frighten the people by the emperor's side to death. In such a situation, the emperor was sufficiently calm that he did not fly into a rage and chop off the heads of the officials by his side. Fan Xian slowly lowered his head and gently touched the index and ring fingers of both of his hands, forming a bridge. In an instant, he circulated all the tyrannical Zhenqi in his body, urging the two circulations in his body that were different from everyone else's to circulate quickly. He forced his six senses to the clearest realm. In an instant, the aura on his body grew greatly, stirring up a gust of wind on the summit of the mountain. The sand and stones moved slightly. The tiger guards guarding the emperor's side were startled. At such a sensitive moment, they all made defensive movements. Only old eunuch Hong was standing behind the emperor in a half-asleep state. A moment later, Fan Xian respectfully reported, Your Majesty, it is a bit strange. The other party seems to have retreated. Hearing these words, the emperor's brows furrowed. A moment later, he faintly said, Just how many people did he bring? He dared to try to seal off the entire mountain and not let a single person out. Yan Xiaoyi has a big appetite. The officials on the summit, including Fan Xian, were all confused. Only the emperor clearly determined the rebel army's intentions. They gave the imperial army a chance to regroup. They were afraid that the two sides would fight and enter a chaotic situation, leaving some survivors out of this large net. The rebel army at the foot of the mountain was prepared to not let a single person escape Dong Mountain and report to the surrounding provinces. Impossible, Fan Xian said. He knew that according to the Overwatch Council's procedures, the 6th Bureau swordsmen mixed with the Imperial Army would find an opportunity at the first instant to break out of the heavy encirclement and inform the Dongshan Road government to urgently mobilize the provincial and nearest troops to come to their aid. Given the ability of the 6th Bureau swordsmen to move in the dark, even if there were tens of thousands of riders at the foot of the mountain, they would not be able to kill or capture all of these swordsmen. There would always be a few people that would be missed. A shadow-like gray-clothed man floated up from the 10,000 steps to heaven. This person's qigong was excellent, but his posture was strange. It was as if there was a spring installed in his knee joints. Each time he touched the ground, he bounced up gently. Although his posture was not as graceful as that of a powerful warrior, it was superior in that he was fast and quiet. Before the gray-clothed man reached the summit, countless snowflakes had already bloomed in the night sky. The tiger guards hiding around the emperor raised their long knives and chopped down. In an instant, they covered up the splendor of the moon. The gray-clothed man did not attack. He only held up a token. Under the moonlight and knife light, the token was very obvious. It was the token of the Overwatch Council. Eunuch Yao waved his hand. The tiger guards pulled back their knives, but they still revealed themselves. They surrounded the gray-clothed man in the center. A dozen long knives pointed in a threatening manner. Fan Xian believed that even if he was between these dozen long knives, he would only be able to run for his life. However, he took a step closer to the gray-clothed man with a questioning and worried expression on his face. The gray-clothed man was one of the two wings of the Overwatch Council, Wang Qinian. He was Fan Xian's trusted aide. When the sudden change occurred, he had led the Overwatch Council people to set up defenses at the foot of the mountain. He had long been shocked beyond words. He didn't say much to Fan Xian. Surrounded by the knife-wielding men, he knelt in front of the emperor and Fan Xian. In a low voice he said, 5,000 rebel soldiers, armed with crossbows, all of them archers. At the same time, everyone on the summit fell silent because of this news. First of all, this news proved the emperor's judgment. The attacking rebel soldiers were Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers. Only a god of archery like Yan Xiaoyi could train all of his trusted soldiers into 1 in 1,000 master archers. Although the distance of an arrow was not as far as a crossbow, it was faster than a crossbow. 5,000 master archers had attacked in the dark. It was said that Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers were all longbowmen. No wonder the Imperial Army and Overwatch Council people at the foot of the mountain had such difficulty resisting. The emperor looked at Wang Qinian kneeling in front of him and asked in a low voice, "How is the battle situation?" Wang Qinian's tone froze. He immediately replied, "When we were attacked, I went up the mountain. I do not know the current situation." The emperor huffed coldly but did not continue to express his dissatisfaction. It had not been long since the attack. The distance between the top and bottom of the mountain was very far. Other than the signal arrows, Wang Qinian was the first official to rush to the top of the mountain to report. Looking at his deathly pale face, one could tell that this short charge up the mountain had used up most of his spiritual and internal strength. 5,000 longbowmen? The emperor suddenly laughed coldly. They want to wipe out 2,000 imperial soldiers. Xiaoyi does not have such ambitions. I am truly curious who the master at the foot of the mountain is. The rebel soldiers had sealed the mountain and were not attacking. The situation was a bit strange. Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian and straightforwardly asked, "Have we broken through?" The Overwatch Council acted according to protocol. If a superior asked a question, the subordinate knew what it was. Wang Qinian's expression changed slightly. He reported to Fan Xian, 17 members of the 6th Bureau, all dead. Fan Xian's expression did not change. Are you sure? Yes. Wang Qinian lowered his head and reported. I turned back halfway up the mountain. There were battles on the two quiet paths to the southwest and northwest. There were aces lying in ambush. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. His heart ached for a moment. He forcefully pushed down the growing anger and sorrow. The 6th Bureau always walked in the dark. Among Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers, where would there be such swordsmen who were used to assassinations? To be able to kill all of his subordinates in the darkness proved that the assassins were of a much higher level than the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. He then glanced deeply at Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian did not nod or shake his head. He only moved his right hand, which was on the ground, slightly. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that 13th Wang was fairly well behaved and relaxed a little. Turning to look at the emperor, he didn't hesitate. Without hesitation, he calmly said, "Your Majesty, Dongyi's people have also come." Hearing these words, the emperor did not react at all. It was as if he was waiting for something. A moment later, Eunuch Yao walked back from the stone steps and quietly said something by the emperor's ear. The emperor's expression gradually darkened. Only now did Fan Xian know that when the first warning arrow had risen, Eunuch Yao had already arranged for the tiger guards to begin breaking out of the encirclement and send a message. Now he had received a report confirming that the breakout had failed. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council and the valiant tiger guards had twice tried to break out of the encirclement but had both failed. Just how many aces had Dongyi lent to the eldest princess? Had the sword hut, which produced the most 9th-level aces in the world, all gathered at the foot of Dong Mountain? Had Sigujian come? The night wind rose again on the summit of the mountain. The little boat on the distant ocean was still both far and near. The sounds of killing at the foot of the mountain gradually died down. The moonlight shone on the mountain woods but could not brush away the darkness in the woods. No one knew how much hidden killing intent was waiting for the people on the summit of the mountain. The emperor suddenly thought of the scene of Fan Xian circulating his qi earlier and coldly asked, "Your martial arts are getting better. Has the old illness from last year recurred? Fan Xian didn't understand why the emperor would suddenly ask such an irrelevant question at this time. He replied, "It has not recurred." "Very good." The emperor calmly gazed at the vast land under the moonlight. "Then I will leave this matter to you with peace of mind. Get out." The emperor roared darkly and angrily. On the summit of the mountain, other than the emperor, Fan Xian, old eunuch Hong, and the tiger guards hidden in the darkness, everyone else obeyed the order and rolled back into their temples and residences, leaving this place empty for the emperor and the commissioner, the pitiful father and son. My journey to worship the heavens this time was a gamble. What I worship is the heavens, and what I gamble on is also the heavens. A seriousness flashed between the emperor's brows. I don't want to wait any longer, so I am gambling with my life. I am gambling on the fate of heaven. Whether it succeeds or fails, it is all within my calculations. If it succeeds, the Qin court will no longer have internal worries. Within 3 years, the sword will point to the world and no one will dare to slow my steps. However, he did not say what would happen if he failed. Coldly, he said, "Perhaps I have calculated wrongly. Tonight, I lured Uncle Luyun up the mountain. I had thought those two people would not interfere. After all, this is the Qin kingdom breaking its own pillars. If it had been in the past, they would have stood by and watched." Fan Xian stood silently to the side. He was certain that the 9th-level aces from Dongyi were participating in the rebel army at the foot of the mountain. As for whether or not Sigujien would come, no one could guess. Even if that idiot comes, so what? However, the emperor slowly closed his eyes and sighed. "I must consider what comes after, so you can go down the mountain." Fan Xian raised his head in surprise, not knowing how to respond. He had thought for a long time about how to convince the emperor to let him go down the mountain. He had not expected the emperor to bring up this idea himself. However, the paths down the mountain were all sealed. In addition to the terrifying 9th-level swordsman from Dongyi, how could he go down the mountain? The emperor smiled mockingly and said, "Do you think I will drag you by my side and force Lao Wu to act?" Fan Xian smiled helplessly. The emperor took a deep breath. It was as if he wanted to suck in all of the moonlight on the summit of the mountain into his chest. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "Regardless of whether or not I succeed, Jingdo will certainly say I am dead. Thus, I want you to go down the mountain. I want you to go back." He looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Of my 4 sons, 2 of them are worse than pigs and dogs. Go back to the capital on my behalf and teach them a lesson. Don't disappoint me." The emotions in Fan Xian's heart were complicated. He then heard the emperor's words that were even gentler than the sea breeze. "There is no need to stay here to gamble your life with me. Go back to the capital. If the outcome of the matter is not what I imagine, you can do whatever you want. You decide who sits in that chair." Fan Xian's heart shook. He was speechless. Chapter 526. There were 3 reasons for Fan Xian's shock. First, the emperor sending him down the mountain contained a glimmer of pity for his son. It was truly unexpected. Second, the emperor's words seemed to no longer have his usual confidence. Third, the emperor's last words, "Who would sit in that chair and let him decide?" Were those last words or something else? The problem was, even if he was lucky and could make it back to Jingdo before the eldest princess announced the truth, what power did he have to turn his ideas into reality? This was not the Jiangnan Ming family, the Cui family, the court officials in Jingdo, or the pitiful people in the imperial observatory. It was the royal palace and the ownership of the world. A bitter smile appeared at the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Even if he was a powerful official in the Qin kingdom, he didn't have a single soldier in his hands. What could he use to help the emperor stabilize Jingdo? What right did he have to decide the ownership of that chair? "I will not lose." A glimmer of a smile bloomed at the corners of the emperor's lips. The smile was filled with cold killing intent. "Even if I lose, if He Luyun and Sigujien accompany me in death, what is there to be afraid of? You don't have to worry. Director Qin is in Jingdo, and the Empress Dowager is in the palace. Those people won't be able to cause much trouble. Take my edict and my royal seal. If anyone dares to stop you, kill them all." Cold sweat beaded on Fan Xian's forehead. If the Yi and Qin families also rebelled, even if he was a great grandmaster, the most he could do was fight a guerrilla battle. How could he kill them all? He could already see the glimmer of uncertainty in the emperor's heart. His mood couldn't help but grow dim. If the emperor truly died on Dong Mountain, what would the world become? Regardless of whether it was the crown prince or the second prince succeeding, there would probably be no place for him in the Qin kingdom. Did he really have to hold on to that treasure bowl and take the second path? However, the situation had not reached its most dangerous moment. There was still old eunuch Hong and Uncle Wu Zhu on the mountaintop, as well as over 100 tiger guards. No matter what kind of powerful enemy they encountered, they would be able to hold out for a long time. There was only one way to forcefully climb Dong Mountain. The mission of the 5,000 longbowmen at the foot of the mountain was clearly to cut off Dong Mountain's connection to the rest of the world. It had to be cut off for at least 3 days to make time for the Jingdo incident. If they truly wanted to kill the emperor, these rebel soldiers would not be of any use. The emperor would not stupidly go down the mountain. And then, Yi Luyun would climb the mountain. This was indeed a gamble. If the situation of the three countries remained the same as before, the ruler of Qing Kingdom setting up a trap to kill Yi Luyun, Northern Qi and Dongyi would certainly be happy to see it succeed. Ku He and Sigu Jian would not cast aside their identities and interfere. But, the cold sweat on Fan Xian's forehead had already dried. His body only felt cold. When he was in Wuzhou, his father-in-law Lin Ruofu had reminded him that for a sufficiently alluring and even somewhat gorgeous goal, the great grandmasters might naturally walk together. The bitterness in Fan Xian's mouth grew. If the situation continued to develop like this, how could there be anyone left alive on Dong Mountain? But could it be that the emperor did not predict this situation from the very beginning? He carefully glanced at the emperor's face and found that the emperor's expression was somewhat gloomy. In the night, his pupils were flashing with flames. He didn't continue thinking about these questions. He quickly analyzed the situation in front of him in his mind. The outcome of the battle at Dong Mountain was unknown. If it reached a stalemate, there would be problems in Jingdo. He had to bring the news that the emperor was still alive to Jingdo and the Empress Dowager's side. Even if the emperor died and he returned to Jingdo, he had to let the Empress Dowager believe that the emperor was still alive. Otherwise, given the judgment of a political figure like the Empress Dowager, once she learned of the emperor's death, she would certainly choose to have the Qin family protect the crown prince's ascension to the throne and stabilize the Qin court. The emperor was her son. If someone wanted to harm the emperor, the Empress Dowager would certainly not allow it. If the emperor's death became a certain reality, as the oldest member of the royal family, the Empress Dowager had to consider the continued existence of the entire royal family and the survival of the world. Regardless of whether it was for his own safety or the situation in Jingdo, Fan Xian knew that the emperor's arrangements were correct. He had to bring the emperor's personally written letter and royal seal back to Jingdo to stabilize the situation and deal with the post-Grandmaster era. In the post-Grandmaster era, regardless of who won or lost in the battle at Dong Mountain, there would certainly be one or two great grandmasters who would leave the stage of history. He nodded silently and said, "Please rest assured, Your Majesty. Nothing will happen to Jingdo." The emperor glanced at him deeply and said, "The road ahead will be difficult and dangerous. You must be careful." Fan Xian was slightly startled. Originally, in the depths of his heart, he had been full of mockery and self-mockery toward the emperor's earlier words, "I have 4 sons." Unexpectedly, after hearing these words, his heart softened slightly. Fastening his belt and confirming that he was fully equipped, Fan Xian quickly changed from an official to a 9th-level night walker. He restrained his aura from head to toe. It was as if he wanted to become one with the scenery at the summit of Dong Mountain. Only the infuriating silver moonlight shone unharmoniously on his body. He carried the emperor's royal seal and the letter to the Empress Dowager. They were not very heavy, but he felt very heavy. He knew that the news of Dong Mountain being surrounded would certainly return to Jingdo soon. At the same time, the news that would return would be that the emperor had been assassinated. The eldest princess had used the perfect time difference. She didn't even need to prepare anything in Jingdo. As long as she confirmed the emperor's death, the Empress Dowager would have to walk out sorrowfully from behind the curtain and choose one of the 3 princes to inherit the throne. At this time, the worship to heaven had not been completed. The heavenly edict had not descended. Although everyone under heaven knew that the crown prince was about to be deposed, the crown prince was still the crown prince. Regardless of whether one looked at it from the perspective of the stability of court politics or any other angle, the Empress Dowager would choose the crown prince to inherit the throne. This was not a conspiracy. It was just taking advantage of the situation. Even if the emperor had countless backup plans in Jingdo and Qin and the imperial army were equally loyal, once the news of the emperor's death spread through the world, who would openly disobey the Empress Dowager's edict? Unless they wanted to rebel a second time. Fan Xian stretched his limbs as if he wanted to lighten the burden on his body. He knew that he was essentially carrying the Qin Kingdom's dragon chair on his back. After all, they are your brothers. The emperor stood beside the black-clothed Fan Xian and coldly said, The emperor stood beside the black-clothed Fan Xian and coldly said, "If we can avoid killing we won't, particularly Qingze. If I have to then I'll kill them all." Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly and he nodded. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly. Gazing at the little boat in the distance, he mockingly said, "Why is Uncle Luyun so slow? As a great grandmaster, do you still have uncontrollable cowardice when facing me? Do you still need helpers?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He raised his head to glance at the bright moon in the sky and furrowed his brows. "During the day, I once told you why I chose Dong Mountain to worship heaven," the emperor suddenly said. "The first reason was to invite Fifth Prince out of the mountain." Fan Xian looked at the emperor. The emperor gazed at him calmly and said, "The second reason is that Dong Mountain is a lonely peak by the sea. It is the best place to die. Yunrui had Yin Xiaoyi surround the mountain and then invited Uncle Luyun to come up and assassinate me. I have nowhere to go." Dong Mountain was isolated by the sea. There was only one dead end to the foot of the mountain. The side of the mountain facing the sea was a stone wall as smooth as jade. Even a great grandmaster would not be able to use lightness skills to ascend. If the emperor was assassinated there, it would truly be difficult for him to escape. "I chose Dong Mountain as a place of death to give Yunrui a misconception." The emperor seemed to have shaken off the news that Sigu Jian might have come and recovered his confident expression. Calmly, he looked into Fan Xian's eyes as if he wanted to see through his heart. She thought she could seal off all news of Dong Mountain and let her do as she pleased in Jingdo. She forgot that I chose this place of death because I have a living person by my side who can fly out of this place of death. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He thought that even his ultimate skill had not escaped the emperor's eyes. It looked like there were not many things about him that the emperor didn't know. In this world, probably only his strange method of channeling qi could help him slide down the mirror-smooth Dong Mountain. The emperor had captured him and brought him to Dong Mountain to set up an ambush there. The emperor had indeed thought far into the future. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He was no longer as worried as before. Since the emperor could even use him, how could he not have a plan to deal with the most dangerous situation in front of him? The emperor smiled slightly and said, "I once told Gong Dian that your ability to climb walls is very similar to mine. Much better than mine." Fan Xian looked at the abyss-like cliff under his feet and twisted his neck. In a rare moment he made a joke. "It's a pity that the moonlight tonight is too bright. The moon waxes and wanes. That's what you once said." The emperor raised his head to the sky and said, "I cannot predict everything that will happen, but I know that the moon cannot remain this bright forever." As his words fell, a layer of dark clouds floated in from the sky and hid the full moon behind them. The silver light suddenly disappeared. Night once again descended upon the land. The summit of Dong Mountain was completely dark. There was no trace of Fan Xian at the emperor's side. The dark forest at the foot of the mountain was filled with the smell of blood. It was even more fishy than the sea breeze. Occasionally the moonlight would brush through the forest. It was faintly possible to see corpses everywhere in the forest. Some of the corpses were lying on the ground while others were leaning weakly against tree trunks. Most of the dead wore the uniform of the Imperial Army. What was more consistent was that these Imperial Army soldiers who had been killed had numerous arrows pierced through their bodies. The arrows pierced deep into the bodies of the dead and viciously pinned them to the trees and the ground. The scene appeared wretched and terrifying. The forest at the foot of Dong Mountain was dense. The road was covered by the darkness and the forest at the same time. It was impossible to see its general appearance. One could only see countless corpses and blood. The closer they got to the foot of the mountain, the more intense the battle earlier could be seen. Fires lit and then extinguished. Only a few trees in the forest near the mountain gate were still burning. They only lit up a corner of the silent night. The smell of burning on the ground gradually rose, suppressing the smell of blood and the sea breeze. It made the soldiers on both sides nervous. Whoosh! A sharp sound broke through the air. A long arrow shot out like lightning and hit an Imperial Army soldier closest to the edge of the forest. The Imperial Army soldier gripped the long arrow in his chest and wanted to pull it out. Under the intense pain he no longer had the strength. Slowly he sat down. Just as he was about to sit down, 3 more arrows pierced through the air and pierced into his body. The Imperial Army soldier's head tilted to the side. Blood sprayed from his lips as he died. It was completely silent at the foot of the mountain. The 5,000 rebel soldiers had come to Dong Mountain without anyone knowing and launched the most despicable and sudden night attack on the 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers. The Imperial Army was unable to react in time. Additionally, they had followed the royal entourage to worship heaven and had not prepared the heavy armor needed for battle in the field. The attacking rebel army was Yan Xiaoyi's personal camp. More than 5,000 longbowmen and marksmen had feigned an attack between Sangzhou and Yanjing. With Sigu Jian's tacit approval and purposeful concealment, they had passed through the 16 vassal states of Dongyi and emerged from a secret tunnel to the north of Danzhou. Using nearly 20 days, they had sealed off Dong Mountain like 5,000 ghosts. The scouts along Dong Mountain had all been killed by the aces of the rebel army. They didn't have time to send out any news. 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers without heavy armor had been ambushed by 5,000 longbowmen. One could imagine the heavy price they had to pay. What made these Imperial Army soldiers most angry and pained was that the first wave of attack from the rebel army archers was actually fire arrows. In that instant, it was as if thousands of sky lanterns had been lit at the foot of Dong Mountain. They floated toward the Imperial Army camp. The moment the fire arrows landed on the ground, they ignited. The camp began to burn. The forest began to burn. Everything began to burn. The power was ferocious. It was the spots of fire that the Qing Emperor and his group on the summit of the mountain saw. It was impossible for the Imperial Army to divert their attention to put out the fire. The burning fire and the suddenly bright night forest exposed all of their figures to the opposing archers. Although the Imperial Army was well trained and immediately found a suitable cover in the first instant, they still lost more than 200 lives in the rain of arrows that followed closely behind. What followed was a bloody and tedious counterattack, a surprise attack, failure, and annihilation. The ground was littered with bodies and the mountain was covered in fresh blood. In just a few rounds, the rebel army had defeated the Imperial Army and obtained an initial victory. They had sealed off the Imperial Army troops in an area half a li to the left of the mountain gate. The rebel army's attack suddenly stopped. There was only the occasional cold arrow that shot out and coldly killed the Imperial Army soldiers who had tried to break out of the encirclement to report. The occasional sound of an arrow made the suddenly deathly silent forest at the foot of the mountain even quieter. It was a deathly silence. Suddenly, a person covered in blood abruptly stood up from the pile of corpses. For such a scene to suddenly appear on such a moonlit night and in such a hellish field, the soldiers on both sides felt terror. However, they immediately grew numb. So many people had died. Who would be afraid of a corpse turning? The fingers of the archers Yan Xiaoyi had sent out trembled. 10 arrows shot out. The target of each arrow was not the same. They were aimed at a certain spot on the bloody man's body and enveloped his entire body. It was very mournful, making it impossible for the person to dodge. This was a military order. No one was allowed to break out of the encirclement. Thus, each time the attacking rebel army shot a person, they had to ensure that person died. Suddenly, someone walked out from the pile of corpses. The archers unconsciously released their arrows, thinking, "Are you still not dead?" However, no one expected that the bloody man did not care about the 10 soul-devouring arrows in front of him at all. He just casually picked up 2 corpses beside him and used them as shields. Pu piu piu piu. A series of muffled sounds rang out. More than 10 arrows shot at the bloody man at almost the same time. However, in the next moment, it was clear that they had only shot at the bloody man's dancing corpse. Countless amounts of blood sprayed out, dyeing the bloody man even more horrifying. The corpse was heavier than the shield, yet this bloody man was able to dance the corpse and block the extremely fast arrows. It had to be said that this person's arm strength was very shocking. His vision and realm were even more stunning. Someone in the rebel army camp seemed to have given the order, so there were no arrows fired at the same time. The bloody man slowly put down the corpse in his hand. He grimaced as if he was sorrowful, sympathetic, and emotional about something. Then he slowly walked in the direction of the mountain gate. Without the disturbance of the arrows, he walked very calmly. He walked to the foot of the mountain gate. A thunderous cheer came from the Imperial Army. They didn't know who this bloody man was, but they knew he was an official of the Overwatch Council and a trusted aide of Commissioner Fan. Furthermore, he was an absolute ace. In the rebel army's third wave of attacks, this Overwatch Council official killed 40 longbowmen alone until he was finally knocked down by the wave of people and buried in the pile of corpses. Everyone thought he was dead. Unexpectedly, he was still alive. On such a terrifying night, at a moment when the rebel army could shoot all of the Imperial Army to death at any moment, the sudden discovery of such a powerful figure on their side was enough to raise the morale of what was left of the Imperial Army. That was why there was that thunderous cheer. 13th Wang walked to the foot of the scorched mountain gate and slowly sat down on the stone steps. Accepting a towel from a member of the Qinian unit beside him, he wiped the blood from his face, revealing his bright and handsome face. He grinned, revealing a mouthful of healthy white teeth. Gazing into the darkness at where the rebel army was, he smiled. 13th Wang was a true warrior. Tonight he had learned to use a corpse to block arrows. He could no longer be considered a brute. If Fan Xian had seen this scene, he would certainly have sighed with regret. The sound of horse hooves could be heard. The rebel army parted and a few horses came out. On the first horse sat a person. This person was shrouded in black from head to toe, and even his face was covered. Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers didn't know who this black-clothed man was. They only knew that Governor Yan had given strict orders that this battle was to be commanded by this person. Although the trusted soldiers strictly obeyed military orders, they were still dissatisfied in their hearts. It wasn't until they passed through the mountains and crossed the water to the foot of Dong Mountain that this black-clothed man gave out military orders to divide and surround the imperial army and beat them into a sorry state. They were all simple orders and direct arrangements. However, they exquisitely matched the terrain at the foot of Dong Mountain and the dark night environment. This black-clothed man's use of troops was truly godly. Reality proved everything. The gazes of the 5,000 longbowmen present as they looked at the black-clothed man were filled with respect and fear. Even the puzzling military order to withdraw earlier, no one dared to question it. The black-clothed man was tall. Sitting on the horse, he appeared even more mighty. It was a pity that he was shrouded in black clothing. No one could see his true face or the might hidden under the black clothing. The black-clothed man looked at the blood-covered young man with jade-white teeth at the foot of the mountain gate. A voice came out from the black cloth and sighed with emotion. How brave. I've tried to kill him 3 times and still haven't killed him. He truly is a warrior. If this person joins the army in less than a year, the world will have another brave general. The black-clothed man suddenly smiled slightly. However, the general trend has already been formed. How can the strength of one man go against the heavens? It is a pity that in a bit more time this warrior will die. Suddenly, someone beside him sighed. The black-clothed man turned his head and looked over. Warmly he asked, "Does Master Yun value talent?" The person who sighed was none other than the first disciple of Dongyi Sigujien, a master swordsman of his generation, Yun Jilan. Fan Xian had indeed guessed correctly. Dongyi had indeed sent out their most elite group of assassins to help the eldest princess rebel army. Furthermore, it was Yun Jilan who was personally leading the group. Yun Jilan glanced at the black-clothed man beside him and forced a smile. However, he did not reply to this question. Because among all the people present, only he knew who the young man who was covered in blood and yet still maintained a smile was. That person was not an official of the Overwatch Council. He was not even a citizen of the Qin Kingdom. He was 13th Wang, his teacher's most beloved disciple and his most accomplished younger brother disciple. Have they all gone crazy? Yun Jilan muttered to himself. He thought to himself, since my brother disciple knows that the sect has sent people, why is he still standing guard at the mountain gate like a fierce tiger? What exactly is he thinking? Teacher sent you to follow Fan Xian, but he didn't want you to truly become Fan Xian's helper. Yun Jilan looked at the bloody man at the foot of the mountain gate in the distance and thought with great confusion. To be loyal to one thing after doing something? To even disregard the interests of the sect? Is this madness, or is it the open killing nature that teacher admires the most? If one does not go crazy, how can one survive? The black-clothed man lightly replied to Yun Jilan's sigh. Yun Jilan shook his head and didn't say anything. Although he didn't know why his younger brother disciple would do this, as the heir of the sword hut, he respected his younger brother disciple. Thus, he would not reveal his younger brother disciple's background in front of this black-clothed man. He didn't know who this black-clothed man was, but all of the troops were led by him. Furthermore, after watching from the side for a long time, he had to admit that this black-clothed man's use of troops was indeed remarkable. He did not take any risks or clever tricks. He fought steadily step by step and managed to deploy the resources of the entire rebel army to a near-perfect realm. He did not give the Qing Imperial Army any chance to counterattack or break out of the encirclement. Yun Jilan brought out most of the aces of the sword hut to cooperate with Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers. The cooperation between the two sides had always been problematic. If the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council on the mountain or the highly skilled Tiger Guards had broken out, it would not have been so easy to completely seal them off. However, the black-clothed man on the horse seemed to have a pair of godly eyes that could see all the details on the battlefield. At the beginning of the surprise attack, he forcefully ordered the aces of Dongyi to go to seemingly unassuming places to set up ambushes. At the beginning, Yun Jilan didn't understand. As the repeated attacks happened in the darkness and the repeated attempts to break out of the encirclement on Dong Mountain were ruthlessly pressed down by the black-clothed man's wrist, Yun Jilan finally understood. This black-clothed man was no ordinary person. He was able to command the entire battlefield and not let go of any possible openings. Such a use of troops could not be achieved without decades of experience on the battlefield. Thus, Yun Jilan was confused as to why Yen Xiaoyi had not personally led the troops here. Who exactly was this black-clothed man? He was guessing. Many people in the rebel army were guessing the black-clothed man's identity. This black-clothed man had only brought 2 trusted soldiers into the rebel army. He was free and at ease, but he used troops like he was moving his fingers. He was free and decisive in killing. He was worthy of admiration. The black-clothed man did not explain to his subordinates why he had stopped attacking. He only looked coldly at the suddenly rising mountain in front of him. Leading the rebel army to attack this time was only a part of the agreement. If he didn't temporarily hold this power in his own hands, it would be difficult for the emperor to make that decision. Suddenly, a black cloud floated across the sky and completely covered the bright moon. The area near the mountain gate was covered in darkness. The black-clothed man sat motionless on the horse. Only the short weapons in the cloth bags held by his 2 trusted subordinates beside him flickered with a faint light. Fan Xian didn't know how long this cloud would cover the moon. He silently slid down the mountain. He didn't slow or speed up. Terrifyingly, he maintained a steady speed. During the day, the jade-like wall facing the sea of Dong Mountain gave off a faint and deep light in the night. It merged perfectly with him, who was wearing black clothing. The knife-like dividing line along the 2 sides of Dong Mountain pierced straight into the ground by the sea. There were aces from Dongyi lying in ambush there, so he could not choose that route. He could only descend from the side facing the sea breeze. No one in this world could slide down from such a hopeless situation, other than Fan Xian. Thus, he was not worried that the people on the sea or the rebel soldiers on land would discover his tracks. He was still incomparably nervous because he always felt a pair of eyes behind him piercing through the night and the whistling sea breeze and calmly watching him. Chapter 527. No one was looking at him. Fan Xian knew this was an illusion. Just like the last time he was outside Shangjing in northern Qi, on the precipice of Shi Mountain, he always felt that there was a pair of eyes watching him from the forest behind him. This was probably the stress reaction of a person facing a difficult and hopeless situation and experiencing emotional shock, particularly the natural reaction of an idealist like Fan Xian. A year ago, when he had sat on the white sailboat to return to Danzhou to visit relatives, he had passed by this great Dong Mountain that seemed to have been cleaved in half by a god sword. At the time, he had looked at the smooth jade walls of Dong Mountain and had thought self-mockingly that he would not one day have to climb this mountain, right? Unexpectedly, all of this had become reality. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, there was the firmament above. Had heaven truly been watching him this entire time? The great Dong Mountain was more dangerous, slippery, and higher than the precipice of Shi Mountain. When Fan Xian reached this place, his body had already begun to tremble. The exhaustion of his internal strength had already begun to affect his body. Like a bat, he gently stuck to the stone wall. His fingers dug into a rare crack and rested for a moment. Raising his head, he could no longer see the lights at the top of the mountain. Glancing back, he could see the increasingly ink-like seawater and a few military ships floating in the water. It was the Jiaozhou Navy ships. They were here to protect. Although they would not be of much use against the sudden attack by the rebel army, it was clear that they could sail away from this place and inform the local government. However, from the development of the situation until now, the Navy ships had not moved. Although Fan Xian had never discussed this matter with the emperor, the 2 of them knew that the Qin family had also encountered problems. A corner of the moon came out, but Fan Xian did not move in a panic. He pressed his face against the icy stone wall and felt the threads of cold air. He thought of a problem. If the Qin family was also counted, all of this was the gathering of all the power in the world to participate in the Dong Mountain operation. No wonder the emperor had not expected it. One person could make all the enemies in the world put aside their temporary differences and closely unite. What kind of realm was this? This was the realm of the Qing emperor. Although northern Qi had not acted, it was clear that the eldest princess and Shang Shanhu had secretly made arrangements for Yen Xiaoyi's 5,000 trusted soldiers to come to the foot of Dong Mountain. Fan Xian rubbed his face against the cold stone. Would Haitang know about such an important matter? Immediately he breathed gently a few times. In reality, this dangerous situation, no matter how he looked at it, was created by Qin Pingping, the old cripple, using many years of time. He had also participated a few times. Whether it was the eldest princess, the Qin family, or the Yi family, they were all driven to the opposite side of the emperor by him and the old cripple with great care. If Chen Pingping knew that things would develop in this way, would he feel that things in the world were really wonderful, just like how he felt when he was on the cliff? The wind on the cliff was very strong. The suction force between his hand and the smooth stone surface was very strong. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body gently opened and closed along his thick meridians to prevent his internal energy from running out. The gentle and natural aura of Tianyi Dao was slowly repairing the instability in his meridians. He swallowed and used the faint moonlight to look at the perfectly straight lines of the rock above his head. He couldn't help but feel some lingering fear. If he couldn't stick to the stone wall and fell like this into the sea full of reefs and dangerous waves, he would probably be smashed to pieces. The wind on this cliff facing the sea was too strong. It poured in through his four limbs and was icy cold. He was not Wuzhu. He didn't have the miraculous martial method to descend from the sky, so he stuck closer to the wall. How did the emperor know Uncle Wuzhu was on Dong Mountain? A question that he had never had a chance to ask rose in Fan Xian's mind. It looked like the emperor probably had some secret connection to the temple. However, the great priest's strange death last year, these things were a bit hard to explain. The clouds once again covered the moon. Fan Xian began to move down the cliff again. He didn't know how long he had been sliding. He got closer and closer to the basin of ink-like seawater. He also became more and more cautious. He raised his martial power to its peak, ready to welcome unknown danger at any moment. The closer he was to the sea, the easier it was for the rebel soldiers on the navy ships to discover him. The closer he was to the sea, the closer he was to the little boat on the sea. The rebel soldiers on the navy ships might not be able to clearly see the little dot slowly crawling on the cliff in the darkness, but Yi Luyun might be able to discover him. His palms pressed tightly against the smooth cliff. Suddenly his pupils constricted. He felt a sharp killing intent behind him. Who could have such eyesight to discover him? Fan Xian had no time to think. Unconsciously, he forcefully severed the Jinqi flowing through his body. The connection between his palms and the stone wall suddenly lost its effectiveness. His entire body slid down. But a black and faint arrow struck where he had been hiding. The metal tip pierced deeply into the stone wall of Dong Mountain and sent out dozens of pieces of rock. If Fan Xian's reaction had been slightly slower, he would have been nailed to the stone wall by this arrow. And at this moment he was still in danger. His entire body smoothly swept down the stone wall at high speed. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. The Jinqi flow that had just been severed was forcefully pushed to the limit again. His palms gently slapped against the stone wall and barely managed to stabilize his body. Whoosh! The second black arrow shot ruthlessly into the stone wall under his feet. It was only half an inch away from his heel. The situation was extremely dangerous. The person who had fired the arrow had clearly planned ahead and calculated the speed of Fan Xian's fall. If Fan Xian had planned to naturally fall and avoid the sudden attack of the arrow, it would have been difficult for him to escape. Cold sweat poured down Fan Xian's back. With a shake of his right palm, half of his body left the wall and drew a semicircle in the air before sticking back to the stone wall. However, now that he was facing the ocean, he had no time to think. Purely unconsciously, he slid down the stone wall by 3 feet. Immediately after, his right palm slapped down again. His body bent strangely and twisted downwards. From a ship on the ocean, a dozen black arrows shot toward him coldly and mercilessly. They brushed past his body, pierced through his clothes, and stabbed ruthlessly into the stone wall. Thud, 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 thud. Fan Xian stubbornly and dangerously dodged on the stone wall. Purely relying on the never-ending training in his 20 years of rebirth and the foundation Wu Zhu had laid down as a child, he unconsciously dodged these unpredictable arrows. The situation was very dangerous. The black arrows came in a continuous stream and didn't give him any time to react. Furthermore, they seemed to have calculated his next landing spot clearly, forcing him to the point where he could fall off the cliff at any moment. Strangely, each time it seemed that Fan Xian would be hit by the black arrows, he would make a prediction. The Jinqi in his body circulated vigorously through 2 circulations, replenishing the Jinqi he had lost. It allowed him to barely ensure that one of his 2 palms would always stay on the stone wall. Each time it looked like he was about to fall, the palm stuck to the stone wall would pull him, twisting his body as he bounced up and down. It was as if he would never be able to escape the pull of the stone wall. He was like a wooden puppet made of black material. His 4 limbs were pulled by the mysterious power in the stone wall of Dong Mountain as he performed a stiff and comical dance on the cliff. The black arrows that followed closely behind his body valiantly brushed past his body and shot into the stone wall. They formed a few messy lines on the stone wall. The front of the lines chased after him with a strong murderous aura. At any moment they could pin this wooden puppet to death and shoot through his heart. Because the Navy ships were worried about the hidden reefs at the foot of Dong Mountain, they didn't get too close. To be able to shoot an arrow into the stone wall from so far away, there was only one person in the world. Only that person could discover Fan Xian hiding on the stone wall in such a dark night. The Qing army's northern governor, Yan Xiaoyi. After an indeterminable amount of time, the black arrows on the ocean surface stopped. There was no trace of Fan Xian on the cliff. The bottom of the cliff returned to silence. There was only the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Fan Xian had finally successfully dodged the chain of arrows and landed on the rocks. Stab. The last black arrow also seemed to have missed. It stabbed ruthlessly into the stone wall, sinking more than an inch into the stone. The tail of the arrow trembled endlessly and made a buzzing sound. There were a few strands of black cloth on the shaft. The sound of the waves on the rocks shook the sky. Fan Xian half knelt on the slippery rocks and began to cough uncontrollably. Fortunately, the Navy ships were too far away. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was too loud. It covered up his series of coughs. In the dark night he did not reveal his figure. His face was pale. Climbing down this kind of precipice where humans couldn't walk, and then avoiding Yan Xiaoyi's marvelous chain of fatal arrows, he had already used up too much of his jinqi and spirit. The last part of the puppet dance on the cliff seemed to have been easily dodged, but it was already a display of his highest realm. Every second, every moment his nerves were tense. He had dodged the impossible. The speed at which the jinqi in his body changed was too fast and the frequency was too high. Even with the powerful width of his meridians, he still could not withstand it. When the jinqi reversed, it injured a meridian below his diaphragm. It made him cough and feel a tearing pain in his chest. Compared to this, he did not care too much about the wretched wound on his right shoulder. Although the wound had been twisted by the sharp arrow until the flesh had split open and blood flowed freely, even the Black Overwatch Council official's robe had been torn and mixed into the wound. It was very painful, but it had not injured any vital parts. It was nighttime, which was disadvantageous to Yan Xiaoyi. However, Fan Xian was on the precipice and was at an even greater disadvantage. Thus this attack and escape were not fair. No matter how valiant Fan Xian was, in the end he had not dodged the last arrow. However, how many people could keep their lives from Yan Xiaoyi's chain of arrows under such dangerous conditions? Fan Xian lowered his body very low. The seawater soaked through his clothes, making the black clothes soak with water. It blended perfectly with the reef that was often submerged in the seawater. Fan Xian was not worried about whether or not Yan Xiaoyi's arrow had been coated with poison. For one, he knew that Yan Xiaoyi was proud and arrogant and had always disdained the use of poison. For another, he took out a pill from his clothes and chewed it, mixing it with his saliva and swallowed it. In terms of using poison, not many people were better than him. The situation on the shoreline was still tense. The ship could not get close to the precipice. Presumably, the eagle-like eyes on the ship were staring at all the movements below the precipice. They had to kill Fan Xian before he came ashore. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and observed his surroundings. The moon in the sky was not bright, but the waves were growing larger and larger. On one hand it protected him. On the other it made it difficult for him to find a safe path. If he were to use his lightness kung fu to fly from the reef, it would be giving Yan Xiaoyi another opportunity to kill him. Fan Xian did not like the feeling of being targeted by an arrow and unable to retaliate, particularly being targeted by Yan Xiaoyi's arrow. Suddenly, a warning flashed in his mind. With a muffled groan, his right palm slapped the reef beside him. Tyrannical true energy surged out violently, and an extremely violent force smashed a corner of the reef below him. His body also followed the strong reaction force, drawing a slanted arc and using the fastest speed possible, he fell into the sea. The moment the splash appeared, it was immediately swallowed up by the growing waves. The white spray at the bottom of the precipice seemed to be incomparably angry that someone dared to underestimate its power and throw himself into the sea full of submerged reefs. This time, Fan Xian revealed his tracks. Although he had sunk into the sea, he could not escape the pursuit of the eagle-like eyes. However, he had to jump into the sea. He had to use the fastest speed and most decisive stance to leave the reef that temporarily protected his safety. Even if the sea was angry, he still had to throw himself into it. He would rather face the angry sea and be targeted to death by Yan Xiaoyi's arrow in the sea than stand on the reef and face the trembling in his heart. A line swept over from the sea. It was a white line. The waves were so large, but the white line seemed to have a power beyond the world. It was not disturbed by the spray. On the contrary, it quietly and clearly drew toward the bottom of the precipice of Dong Mountain. It was like a god's hand holding a magical pen and drawing a line in the angry ink-like ocean water. The white line was actually a wave that had broken through the water. An ancient sword was swiftly sweeping 2 feet above the line. The moment Fan Xian flipped his body away from the reef, the white line was about to touch the reef. The ancient sword and his body met in a flash and then separated. No one knew if they had touched or not. The reef was thrown into chaos. Before the power of the sword arrived, the sword intent seeped out and easily split open the wet black reef where Fan Xian had landed earlier. In front of this sword, the reef was like black tofu. Then the sword swept through the waves and air and pierced into the smooth stone wall of Dong Mountain. The stone wall was very hard, but the body of the sword had completely pierced in. Only the hilt was left like a small dot. Chapter 528. There was seawater in all directions. It was as heavy as a giant rock pressing down on him. The ink-like seawater poured into his mouth, nose and ears, making it impossible for him to breathe. His body swayed endlessly with the undercurrent. He looked like a fish that had been knocked unconscious. At any moment he could be swept up by the undercurrent and smashed into the submerged reef. Suddenly Fan Xian opened his eyes. His pupils were calm. His cheeks gradually puffed up. Using the pressure of the qi in his body and the pressure of the seawater outside, he barely managed to achieve a balance. His right hand stretched out and created a line in the seawater. Suddenly, he grabbed the corner of a reef at the bottom of the sea and stabilized his body at the bottom of the sea. He was a full 40 feet from the surface of the water. Earlier, the sword from outer space had not pierced his body, but the sword intent had already attacked his heart meridian and caused him internal injuries. This internal injury was even more terrifying than Yan Xiaoyi's arrow earlier. The tyrannical Jinqi in Fan Xian's body moved quickly, resisting the power of nature. Tianyi Dao's Jinqi moved gently along the circulation in his body, slowly smoothing out the injuries caused by Yi Liuyan's heaven-shaking strike. Deep at the bottom of the sea, there was no way to immediately heal it. However, it could at least suppress the injury for a while. However, the 2 different types of Jinqi in his body were moving at high speed, bringing a great burden to his body. A wave of power was expanding inside his body. Gradually, 2 streams of blood flowed out from his nostrils. Disturbed by the undercurrent of the sea, the blood quickly dispersed into a cloud of blood mist, covering his face. The arrow wound on his shoulder also began to bleed rapidly. His entire body was like a leather bag filled with red paint. Someone had pricked 2 small holes. It looked very terrifying. Fan Xian's cheeks puffed up and his eyes were wide open. His face had already changed shape. With one hand clawing at the submerged reef, he looked at the surface of the sea like a toad. The problem was, this toad was bleeding and would die at any moment. Thus he could not laugh, nor was he in the mood to laugh. Thinking of the dangerous scene earlier, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The seawater scattered his hair, making it float around like seaweed. Amidst the seaweed, a complicated emotion flashed through the pupils on his deathly pale face. On the surface of the sea, Yan Xiaoyi's arrow was still waiting for him. He could not immediately float to the surface of the sea. As for the great grandmaster breaking through the waves on a boat, presumably, he would have no interest in attacking him again after his attack had failed. He didn't know how long he had been in the sea. The skin of his hand, which was gripping the submerged reef, already had a strange feeling. But he stared wide at the surface of the sea. He had no way to escape. At this moment he finally felt a trace of regret. Yesterday, he should have brought that box with him. If he had that box by his side, he wouldn't have been suppressed by Yan Xiaoyi's arrows. Speaking of which, this only proved that the person Fan Xian was most wary of after his rebirth was still the Qing Emperor. Perhaps this was a shadow left over from history, or perhaps it was just a subconscious part of his intuition. However, he did not want to reveal his trump card in front of the Emperor. He as he could. As he was, as he with the Emperor as. And as he as he as he and to he. He didn't know the Emperor's trump card. He didn't know how the Emperor would react once he knew he had a weapon that could kill gods and monarchs in this world. This kind of thinking affected Fan Xian's decision, which was why he had sunk into his current dangerous situation. Fortunately, he had not died to those arrows and swords. He should be proud of this. If the story of the dance at the bottom of the cliff, the black arrow, and the sword breaking through the waves spread throughout the world, presumably, everyone's understanding of Fan Xian would enter a whole new level. A great grandmaster and the world's most powerful ninth-level ace had not been able to kill Fan Xian. It was enough to make him proud. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body valiantly provided the nutrients his body needed. Without being able to breathe air, he would not be able to hold out for long. Fan Xian's nose and mouth were no longer bleeding. The wound on his shoulder had been soaked in the seawater until it had turned white. Like the stomach of a dead fish, it was no longer bleeding. A glimmer of determination flashed across his pale face. His right hand moved down again and picked up a large rock from the sand at the bottom of the sea. He didn't dare to float up for now, so he chose a stupid method he had learned from watching Hui Yuanjia in his previous life. However, back then Hui Yuanjia had walked on the bottom of the river. Right now he was walking on the bottom of the sea. Hugging the large rock, he used its weight to stabilize his body. Under the impact of the undercurrent at the bottom of the sea, he did not sway. Fan Xian stepped forcefully on the sand and advanced. He did not try to break out of the encirclement by following the shoreline. There were aces blocking the two sides of Dong Mountain. He couldn't guarantee that his remaining Jinqi could support him on the bottom of the sea for long, so he chose the closest path to the surface of the sea. He walked to the bottom of the Jiaozhou Navy's ship. Raising his head, he opened his eyes and calmly glanced at the bottom of the ship, which was darker than the color of the seawater. A powerful desire to escape made his six senses incomparably sharp. He could even clearly see the moss and shells at the bottom of the wooden ship. He put down the heavy rock in his arms. The rock landed on the bottom of the sea and didn't make much noise. It only shook up some sand. His hands slowly drew two semicircles and carried out one last adjustment. Fan Xian relaxed his body and followed the buoyancy of the sea to float upward as naturally as possible. He was terrified of startling Governor Yen, whose eyes were like an eagle's, ears like a shark's, and nose like a dog's. Maintaining the feeling of a piece of driftwood, Fan Xian slowly floated to the bottom of the military ship. Very carefully he moved toward the outer edge of the bottom of the ship. He still didn't poke his head out of the water. Separated by about half a foot of seawater, he did his best to watch the movement on this side of the ship. This was a gamble. The reason he had chosen this ship was because Yen Xiaoyi had not fired the arrow from this ship earlier. If the helper he was looking for was not on this ship, Fan Xian could only dive down again and search for an opportunity on another ship. He didn't know if he would be able to make it to the other ship. Fortunately, his luck this time was not bad. A strange smile rose to Fan Xian's pale face soaking in the seawater. He thought to himself that his luck in this life was indeed incomparable to that of others. He saw a hand on the side of the ship. The hand was very naturally resting on the side of the ship. It was gently making noiseless knocks, maintaining a steady and strange frequency. On the surface of the sea, there were 5 Navy ships slowly cruising. Under the illumination of the moonlight, these ships were like demons searching for prey, slicing through the surface of the water, ready at any moment to nail the prey hidden at the bottom of the sea. Another 3 ships sailed far away from the main group, maintaining a corresponding distance. They were responsible for providing support and keeping a wider watch. On one of the ships, the lights in the middle of the hall were dim. The Jiaozhou Navy general in charge of this ship, Su Maokai, was sitting coldly in an armchair. Of his 3 trusted soldiers, 2 were responsible for guarding outside the hall. 1 was responsible for communicating with the Navy's flagship. There was only 1 trusted soldier left by his side. The soldier's face was hidden in the darkness behind the light. His facial features could not be seen clearly, but it could faintly be seen that his face was slightly pale. No one knew if he had been frightened by the battle array tonight. It was completely silent on the ship. Suddenly, the trusted soldier opened his mouth to speak. Why did the Jiaozhou Navy also betray? Su Maokai was now the 3rd-ranked figure in the Jiaozhou Navy. He had enough power under his command. For a major matter like tonight, if he didn't know the inside story, he would not have followed the Navy's flagship to surround the sea around Dong Mountain. He lowered his head and then slowly said, "Young master, the situation right now is not that the Jiaozhou Navy has betrayed. Rather, it is you who has betrayed?" The trusted soldier was Fan Xian, whose luck was so good that he had quietly snuck onto the ship. Su Maokai was an old member of the Quanzhou Navy. Furthermore, the hand that had been hanging outside the ship proved that he had been secretly hoping that Fan Xian would be able to escape from death. Thus, Fan Xian had enough trust in him. After hearing these words, Fan Xian still furrowed his brows. Fan Xian and the emperor had long guessed what the eldest princess would do. For such a major matter as the Dong Mountain attack, they could at most control the news for a few days. In the end, the emperor would be assassinated and the crown prince would succeed. The matter of the emperor being assassinated needed someone to take the blame. That person had to have enough power to kill the emperor and have the motive to do so. Only then would they be able to convince the Empress Dowager in the palace and the officials in court. Even if it wasn't to convince, they had to give those people a psychological explanation. It was clear that among the group of people heading to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, the only person who had the power to kill the emperor was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, who held 500 black knights and had a few unknown aces in secret. As for the motive to assassinate the emperor, presumably, given the eldest princess intelligence, she would circle around the matter of the old Yi family that the Empress Dowager was most wary of. You didn't respond. I trust that you also didn't send a message to Wu Gufei. You also didn't send a message to Ho Jichang. Fan Xian stood behind Su Maokai and stared coldly at the side of his face. In order to prevent someone from suddenly entering the room, he had only slightly bandaged his wound at the back of the ship and disguised himself as Su Maocai's trusted soldier, standing behind him the entire time. I had you stay with the Jiaozhou Navy for this day. Fan Xian's tone was calm, but there was a glimmer of anger in it. In the end you didn't do anything. The Overwatch Council assassinating the emperor may have convinced some of the generals in the navy, but how could you believe it? Furthermore, why was Yan Xiaoyi on the navy ship? Did these navy generals not have questions in their hearts? Why would they believe in your loyalty and have you come to Dong Mountain? Su Maokai lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, as for the matter of assassinating the emperor, there should be some people who would believe it. After all, the Overwatch Council's reputation is not good. Furthermore, we received news yesterday that 500 Black Knights had traveled overnight from the Jiangbei camp to Shao Mountain. There was suddenly no news of them in the East Shandong Road area. Thus, it makes sense to say that these 500 Black Knights had come to assassinate the emperor. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He had moved the 500 Black Knights here. However, they hadn't gotten close to the area of Dong Mountain. If the Jingdo people came here again and the emperor was truly unable to escape disaster, it would be difficult for him to explain. Fortunately, he still had a few trump cards. Su Maokai once again described the current military situation in detail. The more Fan Xian listened, the more helpless he felt. He had been at the top of the mountain for a day and half a night. Apparently, the rumors at the foot of the mountain had become completely different. Had he colluded with Dongyi Sigujian to assassinate the emperor? Damn it. This kind of method of investigating the evidence is too childish. However, Fan Xian knew that methods were always secondary. As long as victory and defeat were decided by strength, no matter how childish the eldest princess's investigation was, it would become an ironclad fact in the history books. Of course, most people in the Navy have doubts. I even believe that some people know the truth of the Dong Mountain matter, Su Maokai said coldly. Even if they know the truth, so what? If it was still Chang Kuan leading the army in the past, given his and the old Navy generals' respect for the emperor, they would certainly not participate in this matter even if they were beaten to death. Young master, you went on a killing spree in Jiaozhou last year. Many of the old generals have already been killed. Who knows how many generals have begun to feel cold toward the court. Presently, the Jiaozhou Navy is already the world of the Qin family. Even if it was truly a rebellion, I believe the generals on the Navy ships at the foot of Dong Mountain would be very willing. Fan Xian calmly said, you should also know the truth. I have never doubted the changes in the Navy. The emperor also knows about the Qin family. I believe he will certainly have follow-up plans. Thus, I am still curious as to how you obtained the eldest princess's trust. He suddenly furrowed his brows and said, their hearts are cold toward the court. Presumably you have contributed to this matter. Maokai, I had you stay in the Jiaozhou Navy not to have you create a rebel army. Su Maokai was silent for a moment. He then suddenly rose and bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. Sincerely he said, young master, I am not talented. I have never been able to completely control the Jiaozhou Navy in my hands. Since the eldest princess has rebelled and the Qin family has also joined in, you should have seen it. There is still that great grandmaster on the sea. This is a rare opportunity. His eyes stared at Fan Xian's pale face. A glimmer of loyalty and passion flashed through them. Gritting his teeth, he said, young master, take the opportunity to rebel. Fan Xian stared into Su Maocai's eyes and didn't speak for a long time. He knew this general's loyalty toward him, no, toward his mother. It wasn't that he hadn't guessed why he would bring up such a rebellious suggestion. He only gently shook his head. Why? Su Maokai lowered his voice and said anxiously, presently, all the truly powerful people in the world have been attracted to the Great Dong Mountain. Jingdo is just an empty stomach. Young master, take the opportunity to go ashore and contact the 500 Black Knights in the Shao Mountain area. Travel 1,000 li to attack Jingdo and coordinate with Director Chen from the inside and outside. In one move you can control the royal palace. Once both sides have suffered heavy losses at Dong Mountain, you can, as a prince, climb high in Jingdo and raise your arms. Everything will be done. Fan Xian did his best to calm his tone to avoid hurting the heart of the person in front of him. Warmly he said, "The emperor is very guarded against me and has never let me command the army. How could a mere 500 Black Knights enter Jingdo? There are 10,000 Jingdo garrison outside Jingdo, 13 city gate guards in Jingdo, and 3,000 imperial soldiers. How could I deal with them? The commander of the Jingdo garrison is the Great Prince's trusted aide. The imperial army is completely under the Great Prince's control. The 13 city gate guards are directly under the emperor's command. Once the emperor is not present, they are headless people." It was clear that Su Maokai was prepared. Methodically he spoke one thing at a time. "Young master, since you have taken the risk to break through, you must have a keepsake from the emperor on you. It should be a personally written letter or jade seal. You can enter the palace alone, convince the Empress Dowager, and obtain Yi Guiping's support. Outside the palace, ask Director Chen to take action and sweep away the Crown Prince and Second Prince's power in one move." Fan Xian waved his hand and cut him off. "All of this is built on the premise that the Great Prince supports me." Su Maokai didn't wait for him to finish and admonished, "If the emperor dies, you also have the jade seal and imperial letters in your hands. You are also close friends with the Great Prince. If the Great Prince doesn't support you, who will he support? What about the Qin family?" Fan Xian stared into his eyes and said each word clearly. "And what about the Yi family in Dingzhou? How many soldiers do the two sides have combined? The Yi family has run the Jingdo garrison for 20 years. The Great Prince is unable to completely control them. So what?" Su Maokai lowered his voice. "There are 7 roads of elite soldiers in the Qin kingdom. Yan Xiaoyi is in Dong Mountain and cannot move the northern expedition camp. The Yi and Qin families only have 2 subordinates. There are still 4 roads of elite soldiers. As long as you can control the palace, these 4 roads of elite soldiers will all be in your hands. Even if Jingdo is in danger at the beginning, in less than half a month, the entire situation can be reversed. The reason you hesitate is because you have never carefully analyzed just how much power you can mobilize in your hands." Su Maokai stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said each word clearly. "The emperor was attacked by assassins in Dong Mountain. You have the jade seal and the emperor's personally written letter as proof. The crime of assassinating the emperor can easily be placed on the heads of the eldest princess, crown prince and second prince. This is a righteous reason. In less than half a month, this righteous reason will receive the approval of the 4 roads of elite soldiers. Although you have no one in court, Prime Minister Lin has probably left a number of people for you. As for the beginning of the major event, the situation in Jingdo will be turbulent. However, Director Chen is the best at this kind of thing. Also, don't forget Minister Fan. He will certainly support you." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He admitted that for the sake of the rebellion, Su Maokai had secretly put in a lot of effort and schemed for him for a long time. If the situation continued to develop like this, if he could leave the sea, escape Yan Xiaoyi's pursuit and return to Jingdo, perhaps the power of the Qin kingdom would truly be incomparably close to his hands. Was this kind of temptation great? Fan Xian didn't know because his state of mind was clear. He had not thought in that direction at all. Chapter 529. The sea wind whistled past the ship. The waves pushed the ship up and down. Although the lampstand attached to the wall of the ship would not fall to the ground, the flames in the lantern were sometimes large and sometimes small. The light made the expressions of the 2 people in the cabin uncertain. There was the faint sound of a message outside. A soldier knocked on the door and entered to report something to Su Maokai. He then hurriedly left the cabin. Tonight, the people within a radius of 20 li around Dong Mountain had sunk into a tense and fearful atmosphere. Regardless of whether they knew the truth or not, they were all terrified and uneasy. "We need to expand the search area," Su Maokai said in a low voice. His expression was complicated. Fan Xian's words earlier had directly overturned all of his thoughts. If the emperor had not died. Su Maokai did not believe Fan Xian's deduction. Although he didn't know the eldest princess's entire plan, looking at the situation at hand, how could the emperor have survived from the summit of Dong Mountain? As he was thinking, Fan Xian stood to the side and watched him quietly. It was clear that Su Maokai had played an important role in the Jiaozhou Navy's rebellion. Otherwise, the eldest princess's side would not have been at ease in allowing him to bring a ship here. Fan Xian knew that Su Maokai had never had any loyalty to the Qing court. He only had hatred and a desire for revenge. This so-called rebellion was something that happened naturally. However, the person he wanted to help in his rebellion was Fan Xian himself. That was why Su Maokai had not followed Fan Xian's plan and immediately made contact with the Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gefei or Ho Jichang. He had not sent the news of the Jiaozhou Navy's strange movements to the Overwatch Council, thus creating the difficult situation of Dong Mountain being surrounded. This was a chess piece Fan Xian had buried deeply in the Jiaozhou Navy. Because the chess piece had its own thoughts, it had lost its original use. Fan Xian could not get angry. Even his anger was faint because he knew this person's heart. Su Maokai saw that he was unable to convince Fan Xian. The expression on his face dimmed. A moment later he said, "My original plan was to, at the last moment, move my subordinates to launch a counterattack on the sea, disrupt the Navy's encirclement, forcefully go ashore, and receive you down the mountain before heading to Jingdo." Fan Xian's heart trembled. Given the few ships in Su Maocai's hands and the strength of over 1,000 soldiers, he wanted to go ashore to receive him down the mountain. Presumably, he had the determination and courage to die. Who would have thought that you would actually be able to? Su Maokai shook his head and sighed. A glimmer of respect rose uncontrollably in his eyes. In the eyes of these people, a person who could escape from the precipice of Dong Mountain, which was as smooth as jade, seemed to have already left the realm of mortals. Su Maokai continued, "Your guess is correct. This time the Jiaozhou Navy has joined the eldest princess plan. One reason is because of the Qin family, but the more important reason is because of my participation. If I let you meet with danger on the mountain, then I would not be able to make up for it even if I died 10,000 times. Fortunately, because of this, Governor Yen trusts me very much. Presumably he won't be able to find this ship. You can rest assured and stay here." Fan Xian coughed and shook his head. "I have to get back to Jingdo." After boarding the ship, the first thing he did was ask Su Maokai about the situation of the blockade on land and sea. He knew that the blockade tonight had gathered countless powerful people. In addition, there were terrifying 9th-level assassins from Dongyi. If he wanted to break through the blockade on land, it would be very difficult. "Can you have the ship go 3 li north?" He furrowed his brows. "Beyond 3 li, those people won't be able to control a wider area. We should be able to find an opportunity. There are too many eyes watching. I have to wait." Su Maokai glanced at him worriedly and sighed. In his opinion, returning to the capital was not the most important thing right now. Finding a way to contact the Black Knights and then get in touch with the people in Jingdo to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight was the wisest choice. How could Fan Xian not know that if he wanted to obtain the greatest benefit, it would be the best move if he could escape back to Jiangnan, notify Shuiqin, and then return to the capital from Wuzhou to wait for backup? However, this kind of decision was, without question, not something a normal person could make. There were too many people in Jingdo that he needed to care about. The survival of the Qing kingdom and whether or not war would break out. As Fan Xian's position, he had to keep these things in mind. "I can't wait too long," Fan Xian said straightforwardly in a low voice. Fan Xian lowered his voice and spoke straightforwardly. The flame in the lamp rose and fell with the waves outside the cabin. It added a glimmer of worry to his face that was rarely seen. He could leave behind the Great Dong Mountain because Uncle Wu Zhu, whom he was most worried about, was in the absolute environment of the Great Dong Mountain. Compared to Yi Luyun, Sigu Jian, and even old eunuch Hong, he had an absolute advantage. No one could keep him. However, Jingdo urgently needed him to return. They needed the jade seal in his pocket and the emperor's personally written letter to the Empress Dowager. "Outside Danzhou, were you on the ship?" Fan Xian asked in a low voice as he stood behind Su Maokai, still wearing his bodyguard uniform. "Yes." Receiving a definite answer, Fan Xian immediately asked, "When did Yen Xiaoyi get on the ship?" "I'm not sure," Su Maokai replied. "It should have been on the way from Danzhou to Dong Mountain." Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It looked like the eldest princess's alliance had received mutual approval. There weren't many cracks within that could be used. "In Danzhou, you should have seen a white sailboat." Su Maokai tilted his head in confusion and said, "That was your ship." "Of course I noticed it. I want to get on that ship." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. His tone carried a sense of unquestionable certainty. "Yen Xiaoyi's eyes have probably already risen from the bottom of the sea. It will be too difficult for me to go ashore. Is there a way to head north on the sea?" Su Maokai furrowed his brows and said, then it would be better to take the ship directly to Danzhou. However, that will depend on luck. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then nodded. My luck has always been excellent. On the dark surface of the sea, the Navy ship closest to Dong Mountain shone with a bright light. It did its best to maintain contact with the ships around it. The ship was enormous. Compared to the great Dong Mountain that stretched between heaven and earth, it was pitifully small. It was like a green bean in front of a piece of white paper. The soldiers on the ship stared nervously at the surface of the sea. It was as if they wanted to find clues in the water. Occasionally, someone would shout something. Many soldiers held bows and arrows in their hands, ready to shoot into the sea at any moment. A long time had passed since the figure on the stone wall disappeared into the waves. From the surface of the sea to the land on either side of Dong Mountain, countless people were searching for Fan Xian's traces. No one thought that Fan Xian would be hiding on the rebel soldier's own ship. Yan Xiaoyi, dressed in light archery gear, stood silently at the head of the ship. The soldiers at his side helped him carry the heavy golden bow. He picked up a cup of strong wine from the wooden table beside him and drained it in one gulp. He continued to stare coldly at the waves below the cliff. Although a long time had passed, he still believed that Fan Xian had not died. Although Fan Xian had been hit by his arrow and intimidated by the sword that broke the waves, Yan Xiaoyi still believed that Fan Xian had not died. He sent out an order for the navy and the soldiers on the shore to step up their search. Yan Xiaoyi knew that Fan Xian was injured, but he unconsciously hoped that Fan Xian was still alive. It would be best if he was still alive in front of him and then have his arrow ruthlessly pierce into his throat. He loathed Fan Xian, this pretty boy. He hated him because he knew that his only son's death had something to do with Fan Xian. It was also because that night in the streets of Jingdou, he had held a hard bow in his hand. Yet, he had been at a complete disadvantage in his foggy confrontation with Fan Xian. This was a humiliation he could not accept. Fan Xian had to die by his hand to wash away this humiliation. This time, you probably won't be so lucky. A ruthless light flashed through Yan Xiaoyi's eyes. He stared motionlessly at the stone wall of Dong Mountain. He thought of the scene he had seen earlier, the scene that had shocked him. That pretty boy had been able to slip down from such a high, steep, and smooth precipice. If it were not for Yan Xiaoyi's profound realm and startling eyesight, the Navy soldiers on the surface of the sea would not have found a trace of Fan Xian. Fan Xian would probably have used the water to escape thousands of li away. All of the rebel soldiers would have thought that the young commissioner was still trapped on the mountain. This was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of strength. Yan Xiaoyi's heart chilled slightly. He was shocked by the strength Fan Xian had demonstrated. Because the ship was too far from the precipice, his 13 consecutive arrows had not nailed Fan Xian to the precipice. They had only injured him. This reality made it difficult for Yan Xiaoyi to suppress his emotions. How could such a powerful enemy allow him to escape tonight's sure-kill situation? How is the search on each ship? Yan Xiaoyi asked with a cold face. When he did not find a trace of Fan Xian in the ocean, he immediately thought that the kid had climbed onto their ship from the ocean. The people the Jiaozhou Navy had sent this time were all people on their side who knew the inside story. Yan Xiaoyi did not suspect anything. The admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy, Qin Yi, glanced at him and said in a low voice, "He's not on the ship." He was a second-generation figure of the Qin family and the cousin of the Deputy Bureau of Military Affairs, Qin Heng. Because of Fan Xian's investigation of the Jiaozhou case last year, he had the opportunity to take over the position of admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy. Since he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Yan Xiaoyi at the bow of the ship, the Qin family's attitude was clear. Be careful. This person is very crafty. Since he came down from the mountain, he must have something important on him. If he is allowed to rush back to Jingdou, it will probably have a great impact on the eldest princess and old Qin master's plans, Yan Xiaoyi said quietly. Qin acknowledged. Although he was a first-level admiral of the Navy in front of Yan Xiaoyi, this super-level admiral, he didn't have the slightest qualification to be unyielding. Particularly in this siege of Dong Mountain, all sides looked out for each other, but the one with the most power was still Yan Xiaoyi. Yan Xiaoyi looked at the ocean in front of him and suddenly furrowed his brows. I'm worried that Fan Xian has come ashore from the bottom of the ocean. No one can hold their breath at the bottom of the ocean for so long. Qin shook his head. Qin shook his head and said, there are your trusted soldiers on the shore as well as the aces from Dongyi. They shouldn't give him a chance. A strange smile rose to the corners of Yan Xiaoyi's lips. He thought that for that pretty boy to be able to slide down a precipice hundreds of meters high, how could he be judged by common sense? Seeing Yan Xiaoyi's worry, Qin calmly said, Tomorrow at the latest, the day after tomorrow, the plans in the provinces along the road will begin. Although we cannot use the name of the Overwatch Council, we have to send out the news that Fan Xian assassinated the emperor. He is the most serious criminal in the world. How can he escape? Yan Xiaoyi glanced at him mockingly and didn't say anything. He thought, how could a normal general know the power of a 9th-level ace? If he was allowed to come ashore and enter the vast sea of people, even if the court was fooled by the eldest princess and gave Fan Xian the charge of rebellion, who could guarantee that Fan Xian would not be able to enter the capital? If Fan Xian escapes ashore, he will certainly find the closest Overwatch Council subordinate to send a message to Jingdo, Yan Xiaoyi said coldly. Although there are Overwatch Council spies everywhere in the provinces, he is most at ease. The ones closest to him are, without question, the people he left in Danzhou. Qin Yi understood and said, I will immediately arrange for someone to go to Danzhou. If Fan Xian was on this ship and heard this conversation, he would certainly want to hug and kiss Yan Xiaoyi. He had been on Su Maocai's ship thinking hard about how to return to his own ship in Danzhou. Unexpectedly, Governor Yan had given him such a wonderful opportunity. However, why did he have to go to Danzhou? Yan Xiaoyi finished arranging everything and slowly raised his head. The index and middle fingers of his right hand unconsciously curled up. This was a habitual movement brought about by his long years as a bow and arrow. Following the movement of his fingers, his gaze had already landed on the distant and dark summit of Dong Mountain. He knew where the emperor was and what awaited the emperor. Even though the rebellion had already progressed to this stage as a soldier, he still felt 1 part admiration, 3 parts reverence and 5 parts discomfort toward the emperor. If his only son's death had not made it clear to him that his son was never as precious as the emperor's son, perhaps Yan Xiaoyi would have chosen some other method and not done what he did tonight. Fortunately, he did not need to interfere in the matters on the summit. Yan Xiaoyi thought this. Handing over the soldiers in front of the mountain gate to that person was part of the agreement. His mood would also be a bit better. Then he bowed respectfully toward the surface of the sea, wishing that the old man on the boat who was about to ascend Dong Mountain would send the emperor off on his behalf. Chapter 530. Yesterday I wrote that Yan Xiaoyi was 1 part admiration, 3 parts respect and 5 parts uneasiness toward the emperor. A reader asked on Q, 1 plus 3 plus 5 is equal to 9. Old cat, what about the last part? At this moment I looked around and called out to Big Mountain, what about the last part? What about the last part? Big Mountain's reply said to me, that is respect for the author's muddle-headedness. P.S. Everyone give me some monthly votes. The milk-like white mist slowly spread across the surface of the sea. It was quiet all around. There was only the faint sound of water rippling not far away. The sound grew clearer and clearer. 3 battleships broke through the mist like ghosts and gradually revealed their black hulls. Su Maocai stood at the head of the ship and gave orders in a low voice to his subordinate officers. This group of 3 ships obeyed the order and followed the coastline north in pursuit. It didn't take long for them to reach their designated location. This place was about 12 li away from Danzhou. The Overwatch Council's ship with white sails was anchored on the dock south of Danzhou. With the cover of the thick mist, these 3 battleships could approach the Overwatch Council ship without anyone noticing. However, this also brought unknown trouble to their search. The Navy soldiers already knew that the black-clothed man who had escaped from Dong Mountain in the night was the target of this trip, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. They didn't know why their superiors had sent them to the south of Danzhou. They didn't know that Yan Xiaoyi was certain that after Fan Xian escaped, he would make contact with his trusted aide on this white sailboat at the first instant. Fan Xian wore a slightly loose personal soldier's clothing that covered his black night clothes and equipment. He hid in the front cabin of the battleship and was not worried about being discovered by the people on the ship. His eyes peered out through the crack in the window lattice and narrowed slightly. He was worried about the ship on the other side of the mist. The 3 ships headed north on the sea, maintaining an excellent distance from the coastline. Su Maocai tried a few times to get the ship closer to the shore but was worried that his movements would be too big and raise the suspicions of the pursuers. Thus, Fan Xian was unable to go ashore during these 2 hours. Fan Xian had thought about escaping alone, but he was worried about the subordinates he had left in the south of Danzhou. The Qinian unit still had a small group left on the ship. Hong Chongqing, whom he liked very much, was still responsible for the affairs on that ship. At this moment, there were 3 naval battleships surrounding and attacking him. If he escaped, what would happen to the lives of his subordinates? He didn't know if Yan Xiaoyi was on one of the 3 ships. Anger and helplessness welled up in his heart. He had always thought that his luck was extremely good, but now he realized that luck was a double-edged sword. If he didn't show himself, the Overwatch Council ship would certainly become the Navy's primary target. No one on the ship would survive. If these 3 warships were all controlled by Su Maokai, Fan Xian would have a better way to deal with them. The problem was that Admiral Qin Yi did not make such a mistake. The 3 warships were transferred from the 3 generals. More importantly, Fan Xian didn't think Yan Xiaoyi would be so careless. If he thought he was going to find the Overwatch Council subordinates in the south of Danzhou after escaping, why wouldn't he follow him? He sat on a chair by the window and adjusted his breathing. He knew he was about to face a difficult choice. Yan Xiaoyi had moved troops to attack the south of Danzhou. This was using the lives of his subordinates to force him to show himself. Yan Xiaoyi had probably long guessed that he was hiding on a ship. However, he didn't know which ship he was on and couldn't search without giving the Jiaozhou Navy face. The problem was, Fan Xian also didn't know which ship Yan Xiaoyi was on. If only he knew. The white fog grew thicker, but the sea wind grew stronger. Gradually, it blew away the fog, which was as thick as a mountain cloud, to the sides. Through the window, one could faintly see the cliffs and green trees by the shore. Quietly anchored by the shore, the white sailboat as beautiful and lovely as a virgin, the sailboat that had accompanied Fan Xian for a long time, gradually entered everyone's sight. Fan Xian's heart tightened. The cliff and green trees on the shore were too tempting for him. If he abandoned that ship and directly went ashore, even if Yan Xiaoyi was on the ship right now and went ashore to pursue him, he was confident he had a 60% chance of escaping, mixing into the sea of people and reaching Jingdou. However, that ship was even more tempting for Fan Xian. The lives and deaths of his subordinates on that ship were also very important to Fan Xian. When all was said and done, he had lived 2 lives and still hadn't reached Qin Pingping's realm. He had to board that ship. He had to warn his subordinates still deep in their dreams before the Navy rebel army launched their attack. The sound of ropes snapping gradually rang out on the 3 Navy battleships. Fan Xian's heart tightened again. He knew that the catapults on the ships were being prepared. It was clear that the people on the white sailboat in the distance had relaxed their guard because they were deep in the heart of the Qin kingdom and had no major figures to protect. They did not sense the strange movement on the sea. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. With a flick of his finger, he called Su Maokai back into the cabin. In a low voice, he prepared to gamble. The 3 battleships moved in a triangular formation and slowly surrounded the Overwatch Council's ship. When they were still some distance away, the ship Su Maokai was on suddenly seemed to be struck by a wave. There was a problem with the helmsman's control, and the angle of the bow of the ship was slightly off. The rebel army generals on the other 2 ships furrowed their brows slightly. They thought General Su had not been in battle for a long time and had made such a mistake. Seeing that he hadn't alerted the target on the shore, they didn't take it to heart. It was this momentary negligence. With a muffled thud, it seemed to be the sound of some heavy machinery being pulled. Immediately after, a shrill whistling sound broke through the air in the white fog. Several sharp stones flew out from the catapult on the battleship that Su Maokai was on. The enormous weight carried a terrifying speed as it flew across the sky above the water surface. It ignored the gentle mist enveloping it and smashed down without any warning toward the battleship of the Navy that was closest to the shore. A few loud bangs rang out. One of the rocks smashed into the side wall of the battleship and smashed right above the waterline, creating a large black hole. A piece of stone smashed into the main mast of the battleship. With a crack, the thick main mast broke in the middle, revealing sharp and towering wooden stubble. The large sail fell down with a crash, smashing down who knew how many Navy officers. The nooses that were connected to the sail also became soul-sucking ropes in that instant. Driven by the mast, they swept across the ship, tearing through the air and passing those Navy officers who were standing stupidly, cutting their waists in half. It could only be said that this rock had good luck. In just an instant it caused a heavy death on the battleship. Countless amounts of blood, flesh and red water sprayed out. These were 3 battleships prepared for a sneak attack. When they were ambushed from the inside by their own people, everything seemed very sudden. They had no time to defend. It was as if in this instant, the 3 battleships in the triangular formation all stopped at the same time. Time stopped. One could only hear the terrifying sound of huge rocks breaking through the air. Fire! Su Maotsai's face was ashen as he shouted in a low voice. Following his order, countless fire arrows rose into the air at the same time and shot toward the already heavily damaged battleship. The fire arrows landed like raindrops on the already heavily damaged battleship. It was unknown whether the officers on the ship were dead or alive. No one organized a counterattack, much less a rescue. In just an instant, the entire ship began to burn. In particular, the sails covering the ship became the largest source of fuel for the fire. Su Maocai's expression was complicated. Everyone on that battleship was his colleagues. If it was not the most dangerous moment, he would not have chosen to use such a method to ambush. To be able to organize the attack of the entire ship in such a short amount of time, if he had not operated in the Jiaozhou Navy for 20 years and if the soldiers on this ship were not all his trusted aides, he would not have dared to imagine such a good result. He furrowed his brows and gazed at the white sailboat on the shore. From the strange movements on the boat, he realized that the Overwatch Council should have already reacted. He had done what he promised the young master. He clenched his right fist slightly and gestured behind him. On the right side of the battleship that had suddenly launched a despicable sneak attack, the crossbow machine used for close combat on the sea suddenly moved. With a muffled sound, the entire battleship shook slightly. The crossbow bolt with an anchor quickly shot out and landed directly on the Overwatch Council battleship on the shore. The two ships were connected by the rope pulled by the huge crossbow arrow. The people of the Chinian unit of the Overwatch Council courageously sprinted to the side of the ship with the intention of cutting the rope. However, they heard the sound of an arrow of command coming from the sea fog. They couldn't help being startled. They then turned and ran, abandoning the ship with incredible speed. Following the gangway to the shore, they climbed ashore. Like countless shadows, they disappeared into the fog on the shore. Their movements were so fast that it left one dumbfounded. This was the reason the Overwatch Council was so powerful. The reaction of all of the officials and secret agents of the 8 bureaus to the sound of an arrow of command was already rooted in the depths of their hearts. They didn't need to ask why, they only needed to do as they were told. On the sea, a ship burned fiercely. Occasionally, wretched cries rang out. The ship that had launched the sneak attack stopped on the sea and was connected to the white sailboat on the shore. After the people on the white sailboat fled at a shocking speed, they left behind a dead ship. As for the last ship, speed up. A glimmer of fear flashed through Su Maocai's eyes. Looking at the undamaged Navy battleship, it suddenly sped up. With extraordinary speed, it charged forward from the bottom left and directly entered the area of the sea in front of the Pin family. It lay between his ship and the shoreline. Furthermore, he could clearly see that the other ship was already preparing to launch an attack. Earlier, Su Maocai had already thrown out all the stones and fire arrows on the ship in exchange for such a result. Seeing that the other party was preparing to launch an attack, his first reaction was, "Return to the helm." Return. Before he could say the words "return to the oars," Su Maocai's mouth opened, but he couldn't say a single word. A gust of wind forced its way into his lips, making it difficult for him to make a sound. The wind of an arrow. A foot viciously kicked Su Maocai's hip bone. The powerful force sent him flying. He crashed into the side of the ship and sent up a few splinters of wood. It was because of this that he was lucky enough to avoid the wind of an arrow coming toward him. When Su Maocai's body had just been kicked to the side, the wind of the arrow brushed past his face and flew out. The wind of the arrow was as powerful as a pine tree piercing through a mountain. However, it did not make a loud sound and was completely sinister. There was a light whoosh. Su Maocai lay in the splinters of wood and looked at the scene in front of him in a daze. He was so terrified that his body began to tremble. There were a total of 5 Navy soldiers with delicate little holes on their bodies. They still maintained the expression of their last moments of life and death. They stood with their eyes and mouths agape. However, they were no longer breathing. Blood flowed out from their throats, chests, abdomens, and the delicate little holes on their heads. A delicate little black arrow was nailed into the wooden planks of the front of the battleship. The feathers of the arrow trembled at high speed and made a buzzing sound. Blood dyed the feathers of the arrow. With a drip, a drop of blood fell. A drop of blood. A floor full of dead people. What kind of arrow was this? Pulling back the foot that had kicked Su Maocai's body, Fan Xian knew he had lost the gamble. Yan Xiaoyi was indeed on the ship, but he was not on the fire ship that Su Maocai was desperately attacking. He knew that his tracks had already fallen into Yan Xiaoyi's eyes. It was useless to continue to hide. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the battleship that still maintained a fast speed and crashed toward the official ship on the shore. He looked at the bow of the ship at the head of the ship, wearing black light armor and holding a bow like a god. With a flip of his hand, he put on the light-colored side of the Overwatch Council's official robes. He turned his head and glanced at Su Maocai, whose face was half in a pool of blood and who had already lost an ear. His right foot, wearing a calf leather boot, had already stepped onto the rope connecting his ship to the white sailboat. His body swayed. The disguised Fan Xian slid along the rope in the fog. His body was slightly arched and like a leopard, he silently slipped into the white mist. With a swish. An arrow did not shoot toward Fan Xian's body, which had disappeared into the fog. Instead, it shot toward the crossbow rope tied to the right side of the battleship. In an instant, the tip of the arrow tore the rope knot into pieces. The rope between the two ships drooped weakly into the sea. However, there was no sound of anyone falling into the water. Yan Xiaoyi coldly pulled back his longbow and watched as the ship under his feet crashed toward the Overwatch Council official ship at an extraordinary speed. On the other end of the fog, Fan Xian was like a ghost. Holding the broken rope with one hand, he floated into his familiar cabin. He didn't have time to see if any of his subordinates were injured. He also didn't care that less than an arrow's throw behind him, the massive Navy battleship was heading toward his butt. He directly kicked one of the boxes in the cabin. With a loud and clear sound, the sturdy and hard wooden box was kicked by his foot, which contained an endless amount of jinqi. Wood chips flew everywhere and silver light shot out in all directions. Silver light shot out in all directions. 130,000 taels of silver poured out of the cracked chest like a ripe pomegranate whose belly had been cut open. Chapter 531. Fan Xian stretched out his arm and caught the black chest and the silver ingots scattered all over the floor. A slightly rough but textured feeling came from his fingers. This kind of familiar and wonderful feeling seemed to, in an instant, pour boundless courage and jinqi into his body. It made him throw away all of his timidity and fear. He was filled with confidence and did not think much of the ship that was about to crash into him behind him. He threw himself into the cabin. This series of actions was too fast, so he didn't notice there was someone beside him. Thus, when his ambition was multiplied and he carried the black chest, prepared to break out of the cabin, enter the land, and dominate the world, he abruptly discovered that there was an extra person wearing the robes of the Overwatch Council beside him. He couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. He was only stunned for a moment because this person was Hong Changqing, a trusted aide of the Qinian unit he had given the important task of. There was no time to talk. Fan Xian only glanced at him. The meaning of this glance was clear. I've sent out an arrow of command. Why aren't you running? Hong Changqing stared back at him in a daze. The meaning in his eyes was also clear. How could he bear to throw away 130,000 liang of silver and run? He had to watch for you a bit longer, right? Was the so-called mutual appreciation of talent a meeting of eyes like this? Their gazes met for a moment before separating. Hong Changqing moved with incredible speed to stand behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian's left hand, which was as hard to escape as an azure dragon, also viciously grabbed the back of Hong Changqing's neck. Bang! An arrow accurately shot into Hong Changqing's abdomen. Countless flowers of blood bloomed. Hong Changqing's face suddenly paled. Although his previous step had been to bravely block the arrow for Fan Xian, he had never thought that this arrow would so easily break through the wind of his knife and strike his body. The power of the arrow did not stop. It viciously pierced into the silver ingots scattered on the deck of the ship. Coincidentally, it pierced into the silver ingots. It looked like a metal skewer piercing a steamed bun. It was very cute and terrifying. Fan Xian's face was heavy. With one hand holding the chest and the other grabbing the back of Hong Changqing's neck, he sprinted toward the back of the ship. Behind him, the arrows fell like rain, following his footsteps and chasing after his soul. However, they did not make his steps chaotic or slow down. Let's find the Black Knights and meet up again. Fan Xian placed one foot on the railing at the end of the boat and slapped his palm against Hong Changqing's chest, who was powerless to speak. He sent in a thread of Tianyi Dao's gentle jinqi and temporarily helped him seal his blood vessels. His body was like a large bird. Borrowing the power of this slap, he leaped into the air. Lightly and powerlessly, he flew quickly. In the next moment, he had already landed on the shore. He didn't even turn around to look at Hong Changqing, who had miserably fallen into the sea. Although he didn't know what degree of injury that arrow had inflicted on Qinghua, he firmly believed that Qinghua wouldn't die. Since he could survive that hellish island, he would definitely survive this time as well. Perhaps this was a kind of psychological self-comfort, or perhaps it was a kind of blessing. Perhaps Fan Xian truly believed in Qinghua's ability to play dead. On the sea, Su Maokai held the side of his face that was bleeding and said sinisterly, "Reverse the oars." The Navy battleship under him began to nimbly turn its rudder, distancing itself from the fighting on the shoreline. The surface of the sea was covered in thick smoke. Mixing with the white fog, it made people's vision even worse. Su Maokai knew that he had to take advantage of this opportunity to leave this troublesome place. According to the young master's plan, he had to start drifting on the sea and if necessary rush back to Jiaozhou. The ship quickly retreated in the sea. Su Maokai stared at the white sailboat by the shoreline. His pupils constricted slightly. At this moment he could no longer help Fan Xian. He was very worried about whether or not Fan Xian could escape alive. A massive crash rang out. The only undamaged ship of the 3 Navy battleships was like a killer whale charging onto the shore to catch a sea lion. Viciously and unstoppably, it crashed into the Overwatch Council's white sailboat. Affected by the powerful force of the collision, the seawater by the shoreline seemed to boil and raise waves half a person tall. With the shoreline as the center, they spread out in all directions. With a series of cracking sounds, the Overwatch Council's ship seemed to be about to fall apart from this collision. In the instant of the collision, 6 or 7 figures used the force of the collision to rise from the Navy battleship into the air. They maintained a perfect formation in the air. With a few swishing sounds, they landed on the tail of the violently shaking Overwatch Council ship. The most breathtaking one was the one among the 6 or 7 people, Yan Xiaoyi, who was dressed in thin black armor. He was like a god as he soared through the air and landed steadily on the deck at the stern of the ship like a boulder. After landing he did not move at all. Beside him were 5 aces of the North Expedition Camp's personal guards. Yan Xiaoyi arrived quickly, but Fan Xian and the Qinian unit subordinates ran even faster. Other than the silver ingots and wood shavings all over the ground, there was no one else on the ship. Yan Xiaoyi stood at the tail of the ship and stared coldly at the shore. He stared at the quickly disappearing black dot. Pulling back his wrist, his right arm shook. At some point, the soul-eating longbow with golden threads had appeared in his hand. Loading the arrow and controlling the bowstring, the series of actions flowed in one breath like flowing water. The distance between the tail of the ship and Fan Xian's body on the shore was not too far nor too close. It was the distance at which the longbow could unleash its greatest destructive power. The black arrow left the bowstring with power like wind and thunder. This arrow had already condensed the peak of Yan Xiaoyi's spirit and power. It seemed to have faintly broken through the so-called limits of speed and passed through the membrane of space. It was invincible. One moment it was on the bowstring, the next moment it was already behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not have time to turn his head, nor could he turn his head. Even though he had become the fastest dodging person in the world under Wu Zhu's training, after experiencing a night of fighting and running, faced with Yan Xiaoyi's fastest and most powerful arrow since last night, he still had no way of dodging it. As expected, the tip of the arrow pierced viciously into Fan Xian's back. No, it should have hit the black chest on Fan Xian's back. A muffled grunt came from the fog on the shore. The black dot seemed to stagger and almost fell to the ground from the arrow. For some reason, it immediately pushed off the ground and ran quickly into the distance. Not dead? Not dead? Covered by the thick fog, the people on the ship could only faintly see Fan Xian's figure. Even someone as powerful as Yan Xiaoyi did not clearly see the details of the arrow hitting the other person. A glimmer of fear and confusion appeared on the faces of Yan Xiaoyi's 5 trusted soldiers. After a night of chasing Fan Xian to this point, everyone's confidence gradually faded. There was actually someone in this world who could slip down a smooth precipice hundreds of feet high. There was actually someone in this world who could be hit by the governor's arrow with all his strength and only stagger. These trusted soldiers suddenly thought of the background of the person they were chasing. They thought of the legendary Tianmai being and many stories related to Fan Xian. It was inevitable that some emotions would surge in Yan Xiaoyi's heart. However, his cold face made it impossible to see the changes in his heart. He slapped the railing of the ship and floated to the shore. The faint sound of horses galloping came from the forest by the shore. The 5 trusted soldiers at the stern of the ship met each other's eyes and swept ashore with unswerving determination. In a moment, a group of riders galloped out of the forest and gave up their mounts to Yan Xiaoyi's group of 6. Yan Xiaoyi's preparations could not be said to be inadequate. This trip to Danzhou to lure and kill was carried out by land and water. With fine horses below, how could Fan Xian escape? The sound of horse hooves rang out. The group chasing Fan Xian disappeared into the fog on the shore. After the white-sailed official ship was hit, it began to slowly sink into the icy ocean. Bodies and debris floated everywhere on the surface of the ocean. Hong Changqing jumped down. Fan Xian jumped down. Yan Xiaoyi and his trusted soldiers also jumped down. The 130,000 liang of silver also sank. The chase continued. A day later, in the primitive and dense forest to the north of Danzhou, behind a large tree, Fan Xian, dressed all in black, was sitting on the moss. He panted heavily and occasionally stretched out his hand to wipe away the blood seeping out of the corner of his mouth. Then he gently stroked the small dot on the surface of the chest in his arms. A chill rose in his heart. From his youth, he had known the sturdiness of this chest. Even the black dagger Sir Fei had given him could not leave a mark on it. Who would have thought that Yan Xiaoyi's arrow had left a mark on the chest? From this, it could be seen how powerful Yan Xiaoyi's arrow was. Presumably, those people had not expected him to directly block that arrow. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. With such a chest on him, if he didn't use it as a bulletproof vest, then he would be stupid. However, he knew that although the chest had blocked the tip of the arrow from piercing into his body, it had no way of blocking the sharp intent of the arrow and the powerful vibrations that were transmitted to him. Thus, his internal organs were injured on top of injuries, and his jinqi was beginning to show signs of disorder. That was why he was trapped in the dense forest to the north of Danzhou by Yan Xiaoyi's pursuit group in an area with a radius of less than 10 li. However, Fan Xian was not worried. On the contrary, a faint excitement began to rise in the depths of his heart. He forcefully suppressed his slightly panting breathing. With a gentle pull of the fingers on both hands, he opened the long and narrow black chest. Inside the chest were simple, unadorned, and even simple-looking metal objects. Fan Xian knew that this was far from being as tyrannical and beautiful as the golden silk longbow in Yan Xiaoyi's hand. It was the most terrifying weapon in this world. He closed his eyes and rested for a moment. Then, his hands began to quickly move about in the chest. Following a series of simple and beautiful clicking sounds, a weapon that did not belong to this world calmly appeared in his hands. The last time this weapon appeared in this world, it directly led to the strange deaths of two Qing princes, created King Cheng's ascension to the throne, and gave the present emperor the opportunity to sit on the throne. From a certain point of view, the destruction of the Wei kingdom, the change in the situation of the world, and the power of the Qing kingdom all stemmed from the assault rifle in Fan Xian's hands. M82A1, a simple code name, a black chest, a legendary divine weapon. After dealing with all of this, Fan Xian closed the chest and hugged the gun to his chest. He rested for a while, but he was unable to truly enter a meditative state. Behind him in the forest, Yan Xiaoyi was like a mad tiger, closely following him. Secondly, the feeling of metal coming from his chest made his mind somewhat distracted. He felt as if he was not in the Qing kingdom or this world. It was as if he was in the old world that he had not seen for many years. In the forest of Yunnan, he was fighting to the death with those vicious and evil mercenaries. This kind of absurd feeling twisted his entire state of mind. However, a powerful exhaustion and the excitement and anticipation for what would happen later made him not throw down the gun. Escaping from the seaside to here, Fan Xian had not had a chance to counterattack. Perhaps it was the weakness of caution in his bones acting up. He continued to carry the chest into the dense forest. When he passed by Danzhou, he was afraid he would bring unknown harm to the people and grandmother in the city. Naturally, he could not go forward to ask for help. He drew an arc from a distance and led Yan Xiaoyi and his group into the forest behind the cliff. The scene of assembling the gun earlier had already proved that Fan Xian had not neglected this aspect of training these years. He remembered that when he was newly married in Songshan, he had held this assault rifle every night on the snowy mountain and practiced. Thus, his chest was filled with confidence. If Yan Xiaoyi was said to be a warrior who had used the power of a cold weapon from a long distance to the extreme, then Fan Xian was a beginner who had trained hard for a long time and was trying to kill from a long distance for the first time. This was a showdown between the peak of cold weapons and gunpowder civilization. This kind of comparison from the beginning was unfair. Bang! An arrow ruthlessly nailed into the large tree Fan Xian was leaning against. However, Fan Xian didn't even open his eyes. He also didn't make any defensive movements. He knew that the people Yan Xiaoyi brought were also skilled archers. Hearing the sound of the arrow, he knew that Yan Xiaoyi was halfway up the mountain on the other side, staring fixedly at the activity on this side. The two places were separated by a great distance. This kind of small test would not make him stupid enough to reveal himself. After adjusting for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian opened his eyes. He knew the condition of his body. In such a complicated and dangerous mountain-forest battle, it was difficult for him to recover his yuanqi without sufficient rest. He couldn't waste too much time here. He tied the black chest back onto his body and used his dagger to cut off some vines and leaves to use as camouflage. He then carefully checked the 5 small mechanisms he had left in front and behind the tree. His right hand held the heavy sniper rifle. Using the large tree as cover, he carefully climbed up the mountain. Thinking of the people who had died this night, Fan Xian licked his dry lips as he crawled. Chapter 532. If he had not been forced into a dead end, Fan Xian would never have thought of using the black chest. At the beginning, when he had followed the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, he had always thought the emperor was playing with him, so he had left the chest on the boat. The chest had been on the boat the entire time, wrapped in the 130,000 liang of silver and exposed in the main hall of Suzhouhua Garden, welcoming the gazes of the people coming and going. The emperor and Qin Pingping had almost lost sleep thinking about this chest. No one had thought that Fan Xian would be so carefree as to choose such a place to store it. The most dangerous place was the safest place. This was true for people, and it was also true for the chest. He wanted to go up the mountain because he knew that in this unequal fight, his biggest advantage was that Yin Xiaoyi didn't know what kind of weapon he had. Yin Xiaoyi didn't have the slightest understanding of the terrifying firearms. At a distance of 500 meters, Yin Xiaoyi could only be hit by him. Once Yin Xiaoyi broke into 300 meters, given the speed and power of Yin Xiaoyi's archery, Fan Xian would probably be shot until he couldn't even raise his head, let alone aim. Thus, he had to pull away from Yin Xiaoyi and wait for Yin Xiaoyi to appear in his field of vision. The reason Fan Xian did not immediately look for an opportunity to counterattack after taking the chest on the boat was because he knew that Yin Xiaoyi did not need to aim and could fire 13 arrows in a second. He needed to aim for a long time before he could just barely fire one shot. If he randomly shot on the shore, presumably, he would become the most useless transmigrator to die in history. The assault rifle was not so fun. This was something Uncle Wu Zhu had not forgotten to remind him when he taught him how to use a gun. The wind speed, the temperature, the refraction of light, the so-called error of a millimeter, the difference of 1,000 li referred to these things. Fan Xian did not want to randomly aim and fire a shot, only to shoot through a tree 50 meters away from Yin Xiaoyi. If he let a powerful warrior like Yin Xiaoyi experience the threat of a bullet and know that he had such a terrifying long-range weapon, he would certainly have a way to close in on him and greatly reduce the power of the assault rifle. Thus, Fan Xian only allowed himself to fire one shot. Fan Xian had his reasons for being so careful and thinking so highly of Yin Xiaoyi. Ever since he was young, he had learned under Fei Jie's tutelage. Before he was 16, he had grasped the Overwatch Council's tracking, concealing, and assassination methods. Killing Xiao En on the shore of the North Sea was already proof of his strength. After entering deep into the woods to the north of Danzhou, Fan Xian set down traps along the way and eliminated his traces. Using the help of the dense woods and the steep, leafy ground, he attempted to shake off Yin Xiaoyi's pursuit. However, he was unable to succeed. Yin Xiaoyi and his group always maintained a distance of about 300 meters from him. Only in the end did Fan Xian understand that Yin Xiaoyi had once been a hunter in the mountains. It seemed that he was born with a sensitive sense of smell for his prey. Since he was his prey, it would be difficult for him to shake off his pursuit. As for those traps, they were probably nothing in Yin Xiaoyi's eyes. Just as Fan Xian was quietly admiring Yin Xiaoyi on the high mountain, a few muffled groans and wretched cries came from the big tree below where he had temporarily rested earlier. Yin Xiaoyi looked coldly at the soldier who had been pierced to death by the wooden nails. There was no sorrow in his eyes. On the contrary, a wild fire began to burn brightly. Ever since they had abandoned their horses to the north of Danzhou and entered the mountains, 3 of his 5 trusted soldiers had died to Fan Xian's tricks and traps. The person who had died in front of him was the 4th. Having chased to this point, Yin Xiaoyi, who was a superior 9th level ace and close to the realm of a great grandmaster, had the same thoughts as Fan Xian. He felt some admiration for him. Yin Xiaoyi knew what kind of damage his arrow, particularly Sir Yi Liuyun's sword, had done to Fan Xian on the precipice. If Fan Xian's ability had fluctuated between the upper and lower 9th level before, then after being heavily injured and having experienced a night of running, Fan Xian could at most be considered an 8th level ace. He had thought that personally taking action to kill a heavily injured Fan Xian would be an easy matter. However, such a heavily injured person was still able to lay down so many traps in the mountains. Some of the traps and mechanisms were things that even Yin Xiaoyi himself had not been able to completely discover. Thus, he had killed his subordinates and prevented him from moving forward. A rotting smell wafted through the mountain woods. No one had entered the primeval forest to the north of Danzhou, for thousands of li swamps and rocky mountains bordered each other. Ferocious beasts fought vines. Near the sea, the moist wind blew, blowing out the world's densest flora. The denser the flora, the more dangers were hidden inside. No one knew whether this rotting smell came from animal corpses or from the accumulation of old fallen leaves and the heat of the scorching sun. In any case, it smelled bad and piercing to the nose. Yan Xiaoyi sniffed and slowly circulated the jinqi in his body. With great difficulty, he sniffed out the scent that was well hidden by the rotting smell. The traps and mechanisms all had this smell. The deaths of Yan Xiaoyi's 4 trusted soldiers originated from this. If he had not carefully investigated, he probably would not have smelled it. Yan Xiaoyi did not forget that Fan Xian was Sir Fei Jie's student, one of the most vicious users of poisons in the world. Who knew where else in the mountain woods Fan Xian had laid down poisons? Yan Xiaoyi gazed at the mountain and narrowed his eyes. He didn't understand where Fan Xian's body had gotten so much energy and courage to support him for so long. Thinking of this, the glimmer of a confident smile appeared at the corners of his lips. The more powerful the enemy, the happier it was to kill. Governor? The only surviving soldier swallowed and said in a trembling voice, "Once you enter the dense forest, it will be difficult to walk out alive." He lowered his voice and said, "After all, Fan Xian doesn't know about the secret passages in the mountains like you do." Yan Xiaoyi glanced coldly at the soldier and didn't say anything. The mountains to the north of Danzhou and the primeval forest in the mountains were the key to cutting off the land transportation between Qing Kingdom and Dongyi. If it weren't for that secret passage, it would have been impossible for the siege of Dong Mountain to succeed. Since half a year ago, Yan Xiaoyi had placed all of his attention on the matter of transporting soldiers through the secret passage. He had a special understanding of the terror of the secret passage and the surrounding mountain woods. It was precisely because of this that he felt a glimmer of respect for Fan Xian for being able to hold out until now. There are 5,000 brothers at the foot of Dong Mountain waiting for you to return. Are you at ease letting an outsider lead? This soldier was clearly stunned by the deaths of his 4 brothers and Fan Xian's poison that would kill him instantly upon contact with blood. He didn't notice Yan Xiaoyi's gaze. He lowered his head and said, "Even if Fan Xian can get out alive, Jingdo has the eldest princess holding down the fort. Why bother?" Yan Xiaoyi was silent for a moment. He then waved his hand as if to indicate for the soldier to stop talking. His hand just so happened to land on the soldier's face. With a crisp crack, the soldier's head was like a flattened watermelon, twisted and deformed. His facial features were all squashed together by the palm. He didn't even make a muffled grunt as he fell stiffly to the ground. Yan Xiaoyi glanced coldly at the body on the ground and walked to the back of the large tree. Crouching down, he pressed down on the wild grass that had been flattened by Fan Xian. He confirmed that Fan Xian hadn't left for too long and confirmed the direction Fan Xian had left in. He then silently chased after him. Looking at the figure that flickered in and out of the optical sight, Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath. It affected the injury on his back that had been caused by the arrow. He coughed in a low voice. He wasn't in the mood to admire the wonders of the black chest for being able to preserve this heavy sniper rifle so well and for the optical sight to remain so clear. He only cared about admiring Yan Xiaoyi's mobility and powerful sixth sense. He had been hiding in the underbrush for a while and had been staring at the area up the mountain. A few times he had almost locked onto Yan Xiaoyi's body. However, Yan Xiaoyi seemed to have an innate sense of danger. Every time he stopped for half a second he would move again. Using the cover of the towering tree and the dense foliage, he approached the peak step by step. Fan Xian sucked in a deep breath. He was worried that his earlier coughing would give Yan Xiaoyi a direction. Forcefully suppressing the sharp pain in his back, he wormed his way out of the underbrush and climbed upwards. He found a large tree that required at least 5 people to surround. Leaning against the tree trunk, he panted heavily. Air quickly poured into his throat. The burning temperature and his body's greed for oxygen made each of his breaths incomparably fast. His throat felt waves of dryness and pain, and an unbearable tearing sensation began to rise from his chest. Fan Xian loosened the tie at his collar and forcefully closed his mouth. He breathed through his nose and cursed a few times in his heart. He wondered why he still lacked confidence even though he had a heavy sniper rifle. The recoil wasn't that strong, so why didn't he dare to test it out in advance? Before he could finish cursing in his heart, he felt a trace of strangeness, and his entire body immediately tensed up. Then he heard a light thud. The giant tree behind him seemed to tremble slightly. It should have been an arrow. Fan Xian didn't have much of a reaction at first, but he immediately remembered that his trusted soldiers had all died. This arrow had been fired by Yan Xiaoyi. His pupils constricted abruptly. He immediately bent his legs slightly and relaxed his knees. His body leaned forward slightly. This was the only change in posture he had the ability to do in this instant. This posture could dissipate the force. Following the powerful force behind him, he allowed his entire body to fall forward and do his best to dissolve it. If he forcefully blocked it at this moment, his end would certainly be wretched. With a muffled hum, Fan Xian fell forward from the shock and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. His entire body fell into the thick grass and shrubs. There were countless thin cuts on his face and hands. The bark of the giant tree behind him, about the size of a palm, had completely split open, revealing the white tree trunk inside. A delicate little arrow, like a venomous snake that had been lying in wait for a long time, stretched out the black tip of the arrow. With the tip of the arrow as the center, the white tree trunk was shattered inch by the powerful jinqi of the arrow. Fan Xian didn't have time to look at the strange scene on the tree behind him. He also didn't have time to rejoice that he hadn't put down the box on his back. He didn't even have time to wipe away the blood at the corner of his lips. He had already begun another escape. Relying on his tyrannical jinqi to support his tired body, he ran wildly toward the top of the mountain. Yan Xiaoyi had disappeared from the scope for less than 5 seconds, and he was already within 100 feet of him. This kind of movement and terrifying movement made Fan Xian's heart go cold. A moment later, Yan Xiaoyi, dressed in light armor like a god, appeared behind this large tree. However, his body was covered in mud and he looked wretched. Yan Xiaoyi coldly observed for a moment and then chased after him again. However, as his feet moved, he once again unconsciously lay down in the grass. He could feel a heart-chilling danger that had almost locked onto him earlier. Yan Xiaoyi had once felt this kind of aura in the fog-filled streets of Jingdo. What confused him was that to be able to lock onto him from so far away, unless Fan Xian had already reached the realm of a great grandmaster or was like him and had the help of a godly Bao. But he still carefully lay down in the grass. Half kneeling on the ground, Fan Xian found that the target continued to hide in a blind spot. He couldn't help but curse silently. Putting away the heavy sniper rifle, he swallowed the fishy blood that surged into his mouth and charged toward the top of the mountain. The north of Danzhou was filled with tall mountains. Probably no one knew that at the peak of the mountain where Yan Xiaoyi and Fan Xian were shooting at each other was a flat piece of mountainous terrain. The summit of the mountain was as flat as a grassland. Strangely, there wasn't a single large tree. There was only long grass that was knee-deep and spread out like a green carpet. The strange meadow at the top of the mountain stretched all the way to the edge of the precipice. In the grass beside the precipice, Fan Xian set up the frame and placed the black chest calmly by his side. The expression on his face had already calmed down. He knew he had no way out. Even if he carried the chest and climbed down the precipice, it was daytime. If Yan Xiaoyi raised his bow and shot down, he would only die. Furthermore, he didn't want to run anymore. A person reborn with a heavy sniper rifle was being chased by a primitive man with a bow and arrow. Furthermore, he was being chased in such a wretched manner. He felt very ashamed. If he died like this, he would certainly be laughed at by his predecessors in the underworld, particularly the one surnamed Yi. However, the optical scope still could not capture Yan Xiaoyi's figure. Cold sweat began to drip from Fan Xian's forehead. His figure was also hidden well, but the general area was already grasped by Yan Xiaoyi. There was only so much space near the precipice at the end of the meadow. Yan Xiaoyi would eventually close in on him. The closer Yan Xiaoyi was, the smaller his chances of victory would be. Yan Xiaoyi finally revealed his figure. Like an eagle, he moved along a strange path through the grass. It was clear that although he didn't know what Fan Xian had in his hands, he could clearly understand that he had something that could threaten him. Fan Xian's muzzle extended into the grass and moved endlessly to the side. However, he was still unable to lock onto the quickly moving figure. Although the other person sometimes moved forward and sometimes retreated as if he was drawing a spiral, Fan Xian knew better than anyone else in the world that the spiral would always rise. Yan Xiaoyi was gradually closing the distance between them. 500 meters. The sweat on Fan Xian's forehead dripped faster and faster until it gradually seeped into his eyes. 400 meters. Fan Xian gradually felt a glimmer of helplessness. It was a feeling of emptiness after realizing everything was in his hands was just an illusion. He had no way to kill Yan Xiaoyi with one shot. If Yan Xiaoyi came a little closer, he would certainly be able to use the arrow in his hand to turn him into a porcupine. 350 meters. If he actually allowed Yan Xiaoyi to get close, given Fan Xian's current state, he would not be able to escape from the hands of a 9th-level ace. It was not until this moment that Fan Xian finally understood the meaning of the heavy sniper rifle in his hand. It was meaningless. No matter how powerful a weapon was, it still depended on who held it in their hands. Trying to rely on a heavy sniper rifle to sweep through the world was just the nonsense of an idiot. He couldn't even kill Yen Xiaoyi, much less the strange creatures on the summit of Dong Mountain. Sweat dripped down the small cut on his face made by the grass. There was a wave of piercing pain, but Fan Xian's heart gradually calmed. He knew he couldn't let Yen Xiaoyi continue to get close to him. However, he was unable to use the scope to lock onto that fast-moving figure. At this life-and-death juncture, it seemed he needed some luck. Other than luck, he also needed courage and determination. Yen Xiaoyi. A loud cry came from the meadow at the top of the mountain. Fan Xian, dressed in black, suddenly stood up from the grass. He raised the sniper rifle in his hand and took aim at Yen Xiaoyi, who was not far away. This loud cry startled the ignorant creatures in the meadow. A cunning mountain rabbit began to prepare to run toward the nearest cave. A field mouse chewing on grass stopped its movements underground. Its two front limbs hung slightly, ready to run at any moment. Countless birds hiding in the grass began to flap their wings, preparing to fly into this dangerous place. Following this cry, in a flash, Yen Xiaoyi made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Perhaps it was a decision he didn't have time to regret. He stopped his body and used the fastest speed to remove the gold-threaded longbow from his back. With his feet in front and one behind, he stood steadily on the meadow. With all his strength, he pulled the bowstring to a full moon. An icy arrow aimed straight at Fan Xian, who had revealed himself. In this instant, Yen Xiaoyi saw clearly what Fan Xian held in his hand, but he didn't recognize it. Perhaps it was the Overwatch Council's most advanced crossbow? Since Fan Xian had already revealed himself and was beginning to face him head-on with a courage he hadn't displayed for a day and night, Yen Xiaoyi gave Fan Xian this opportunity. It wasn't that Governor Yen was arrogant. He knew that if he maintained a high speed and fired at the same time, he might not be able to hurt the pretty boy who was more cunning than a rabbit, more cowardly than a field mouse, and better at running than a bird. At a distance of 300 feet, as long as he stood firm, he would be able to shoot Fan Xian to death. Even if he couldn't, he wouldn't give Fan Xian any chance to counterattack. As for the strange object in Fan Xian's hand, human psychology was like this. When it came to mysterious and unknown things, there was always a fear of the unknown. That was why Yen Xiaoyi had been so cautious earlier. After he clearly saw the thing, made of metal, he naturally thought it was a powerful weapon newly developed by the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Once he knew what it was, he was naturally no longer afraid. This was especially so for an arrogant and conceited peerless expert like Yen Xiaoyi. His decades of immersion in archery and his natural talent gave him sufficient capital to be confident. He always believed that no matter how fast the enemy's crossbow bolt was, it was impossible for it to be faster than his own reaction. Even if he heard the sound of the arrow and dodged the sound of the spring, he would still be completely unharmed. Was there an arrow faster than sound in this world? Yen Xiaoyi didn't believe it, so he coldly stood his ground. Pulling back the longbow, he aimed at Fan Xian and released his finger. The arrow flew out. All of this happened in a very short moment. From Fan Xian bravely standing up from the grass to Yen Xiaoyi steadying himself, to Yen Xiaoyi releasing his fingers, it was just the blink of an eye for a normal person. Fan Xian's speed was clearly not as fast as Yen Xiaoyi's. Only when he clearly saw the arrow spin at high speed and come closer and closer to his body did he pull the trigger forcefully. A spark burst out from the muzzle of the sniper rifle. It was very beautiful. The longbow in Yen Xiaoyi's hand was humming. His posture was still as valiant as a god shooting the sun. Then his pupils constricted because he saw the spark. He also heard the very clear muffled sound. However, he had no way of dodging it. The other party's arrow was truly faster than sound. With a pop, it was like a paper bag being smashed open by a naughty child. It was like the water bucket used for showering in the old Danzhou manor being smashed open by a rock. Half of Yen Xiaoyi's body split open in an instant. His powerful body and powerful flesh in this instant became a flower. A flower dyed the color of blood bloomed on the green meadow. Without surprise he fell heavily. In this moment he finally remembered the legend from back then. At the same time the arrow Yen Xiaoyi had shot pierced viciously into Fan Xian's body. A spray of blood sprayed out and nailed Fan Xian's body firmly to the slightly sloping meadow by the side of the cliff. Time flowed again. The mountain hare burrowed into the narrow cave. The vole put down its front limbs and began to run wildly in the darkness. The birds in the grass also flew up and turned into a vast expanse of white feathers. They fluttered helplessly in the air above the meadow at the top of the mountain. At the two ends of the meadow lay two people fighting to the death. Chapter 533. It was the end of summer. The entire land was enveloped in a high temperature. Although this boundless mountain range was close to the sea because of the terrain, it could not receive the moisture and coolness carried by the sea wind. It was only stuffy and hot. That was why there was such a strong rotting smell in the mountain forest and so many heart-palpitating dangers. Because the meadow at the top of the mountain faced the sky, it appeared a bit drier. Additionally, the terrain was dangerous, so there were no large carnivores. It was almost noon, and the white sun was spitting out heat as much as it could, generously bestowing most of its heat onto the meadow. The rays of light were so intense that the grass, which was originally green, began to reflect white light. One could imagine how high the temperature was. The small animals had already entered the earth to avoid the heat. The birds had already returned to their nests in the forest halfway up the mountain, waiting to come back the next morning to search for grass seeds to use as food. The entire meadow was quiet and tranquil. Only the occasional mountain breeze would set off waves that alternated between green and white. The porcelain blue background and the comfortable white clouds gently watched these waves. The entire world was very beautiful. If the two humans and the blood that flowed from their bodies did not exist, it would be even more perfect. With a groan, Fan Xian slowly opened his eyes, which were sticky with sweat and blood. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the sky. He found that there seemed to be a spot of light in his eyes that he could not get rid of. He did not react. This was a problem after being illuminated by the blazing sun for a long time. Unconsciously, he stretched out his hand to wave. He found that his right hand was very heavy. It was still tightly gripping the assault rifle. He switched to his left hand to wave. Then, a bone-deep pain made him cry out involuntarily. The pain woke him up. He lowered his eyes slightly and looked at the arrow in his left chest in a daze. The arrow had all pierced in. Only the last feather remained outside his body. Fresh blood flowed out endlessly and dyed the black feather even more bloody. Slightly bending his left leg, he used his right hand with great difficulty to feel for the black dagger in his boot. Very slowly and carefully he extended it to his back. Following the minuscule gap between his body and the meadow, he gently cut. The shaft of the arrow buried deep in the earth was cut. His body immediately relaxed slightly. However, this slight vibration caused a sharp pain in his chest. His face was deathly pale and he almost cried out again. Forcefully resisting the pain, he used the dagger to remove most of the arrow sticking out of his chest, leaving only a small head to make it easier to pull the arrow out in the future. After doing all this, the pain had already made him break out in a cold sweat. The sweat even cleanly washed away the blood on his face. He faced the sky and took deep breaths. His eyes were somewhat dazed as he looked at the blue sky and white clouds. He didn't even bother to avoid the dazzling sunlight because he felt that there was nothing better than being alive in this world. If he could never see the sun again, he would regret it so much. Fan Xian's luck was very good. Yan Xiaoyi's arrow accurately hit the left side of his chest, but when the tip of the arrow reached his body, Fan Xian pulled the trigger. Although the recoil of the M82A1 was not strong, it still made his body move back a little. It was because of this that Yan Xiaoyi's arrow had hit a spot slightly higher than he had expected. It had avoided the vital point of his heart and pierced into his left shoulder. As for whether or not Yan Xiaoyi was dead, he didn't want to care. He just felt tired and wanted to lie down like this on this soft meadow, on this isolated mountaintop, and enjoy a rare rest. Besides, if Yan Xiaoyi had not died, given his current state, he could only be killed. Since it was so, why should he care? However, he had to care because there were still many things in the world waiting for him to do. A moment later, a weak figure appeared on the suffocatingly quiet meadow. Fan Xian dragged his heavily injured body. Leaning on the sniper rifle, he walked step by step through the meadow toward the pool of blood. Earlier, Fan Xian had always felt that 300 meters was too close. It was so close that it made his hair stand on end. Now he felt that 300 meters was very far, so far that it seemed endless. By the time he reached Yan Xiaoyi's side, he was so tired that he almost couldn't stand. His legs were trembling non-stop. The most precious weapon in the world was supporting his entire body's weight. The fine barrel was deeply embedded in the soil. Fan Xian didn't care. No matter how powerful a weapon was, it was actually not much different from a walking stick. If a person couldn't throw away their walking stick, perhaps they would never be able to walk alone. He looked at Yan Xiaoyi in the pool of blood. His eyes narrowed and his brows furrowed. His emotions were complicated. He didn't know what kind of emotion he should feel. The blood had long drained out and seeped into the earth under the green meadow. The upper left side of Yan Xiaoyi's body was completely gone. It had turned into a lump of flesh that couldn't be seen clearly. It looked like a tomato that had been crushed by someone. The red pulp and flesh were sprayed everywhere. It was extremely terrifying. Fan Xian had followed Fei Jie to dig graves and admire corpses since he was young. He had seen countless sinister and terrifying scenes. Looking at the scene in front of him, he still couldn't help but turn his head. It was clear that Fan Xian's shot had still gone askew. However, the powerful power of an anti-material weapon was fully demonstrated at this moment. After receiving such a powerful blow, even a 9th-level ace in this world could only pay the price with his life. Fan Xian calmed his emotions and turned his head. Walking to the side of Yan Xiaoyi's undamaged head, he prepared to extend his hand and close the eyes of this ace who had died with everlasting regret. However, he saw the already scattered pupils and stopped his movements. It was as if he felt that this person was still alive. "Perhaps you can still hear my words," Fan Xian said after a moment of silence. There was an uncontrollable cough in his voice. "I know you think this is unfair, but there has never been any fairness in the matters of this world." Yan Xiaoyi did not have any reaction. His pupils were already scattered as he stared at the sky. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "I didn't kill your son. It was Sigu Jian. In the future I will avenge you." No one knew why Fan Xian would tell such a lie next to Yan Xiaoyi's body. In reality his thoughts were simple. He felt that this kind of death was unfair to Yan Xiaoyi. For such a gifted ace, his death was very unjust. He knew very well what a person would think before they died. For example, what Yan Xiaoyi remembered the most in his heart. If Yan Xiaoyi thought that Fan Xian was Yan Shindu's murderer and Yan Xiaoyi was unable to kill Fan Xian to avenge his son, this ace would probably be extremely upset. These words were just to reassure Yan Xiaoyi's heart. However, Yan Xiaoyi's eyes still did not close. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. He wondered if he was comforting a dead person or himself. In a quiet voice he said, "What they said was not wrong. You are indeed powerful. You could even try to challenge those strange old creatures. Thus I have no way of killing you. The one who killed you was not me." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian continued, "This thing is called a gun. It is the essence of a civilization, although this kind of essence is not a good thing for that civilization." Yan Xiaoyi's eyes still did not close. However, a crack came from his neck bone. His head tilted and fell into his own flesh and blood. This 9th-level ace had long died. It was just that his bones had been shattered by the bullet. At this moment he finally could not bear the weight of his head and fell down like a falling leaf. Fan Xian paused and stared in a daze at the dead person's deathly pale and blood-smeared face. For a long time he didn't know what to say. After a long time he raised his head to gaze at the sky. It was as if he wanted to find some trace in the blue sky and white clouds. Those who were good at fighting would die from soldiers, those who were good at swimming would drown, and those who were good at archery would die from arrows. This was a famous saying that people had concluded. Yan Xiaoyi, who was a god of archery, had finally died under a barret. Regardless of whether the ending was fair or not, regardless of whether the process was absurd or not, the pool of flesh and blood on the ground proved the blood and nakedness of this truth. Yan Xiaoyi was the most powerful enemy Fan Xian had killed since his rebirth. He still maintained respect for the pool of flesh and blood on the ground, particularly after a day and night of pursuit. At the last moment of life and death, he finally understood one truth and thought through one thing. This would, without question, be of great use to his life in the future. He was overly afraid of death, so he always did things cautiously and gloomily. He was ruthless and decisive, but he never had Haitong's bright mood or 13th Wang's stubborn courage. It was not until he was forced to the edge of the cliff by Yan Xiaoyi that he truly broke through the darkness in his heart. Bravely, he stood up from the grass and raised the gun in his hand. From then on he stood up. Maintaining his respect for Yan Xiaoyi, after Fan Xian had gotten used to the pool of flesh and blood, he still began to mercilessly carry out the follow-up work. Taking down the golden silk longbow beside the other person's body, he laboriously dragged the broken body toward the edge of the cliff. Standing at the edge of the cliff, he measured his position and then slowly crouched down on the ground. Picking up a stone, he began to carve the body. The sun was shining brightly. Between the blue sky, white clouds, and green grass, a handsome and pale young man held a stone and hacked endlessly at the body beside him. Blood splattered everywhere. The scene looked disgusting. He pushed the half of Yan Xiaoyi's body and the stone off the cliff. For a long time there was still no reply. After doing all this, he was unbearably tired. The sharp pain in his chest made it difficult for him to stand. Wretchedly, he sat down on the ground. His head was a little dizzy. He knew that he had to rest and treat his injuries. The flesh and internal organs that remained in the underbrush would be digested by the creatures in this primitive forest in just a few days, and he still had to eliminate the traces left behind by the sniper rifle. He coughed, making the little arrow piercing his heart tremble slightly. A heart-wrenching pain spread out and made him involuntarily give a muffled grunt. It was not at the same time. On the summit of Dong Mountain, far away from the wondrous meadow on the summit, the Qing Emperor, who was trapped in the Qing temple, looked through the window at the warm morning light outside in a daze. "I wonder if the child will be able to safely return to Jingdo," he said slowly. This was probably the first time the Qing Emperor had shown such gentleness toward Fan Xian in front of outsiders. Eunuch Hong smiled slightly. His deep wrinkles were filled with calmness. It was as if there were no 5,000 powerful rebel soldiers at the foot of the mountain or a great grandmaster wearing a straw hat slowly walking up the stairway to heaven. Sir Fan Jr. is a genius. There are no extraordinary figures outside of Dong Mountain, Eunuch Hong said warmly. It shouldn't be difficult on the road. What is important is after he returns to the capital. The matters in Jingdo are not difficult to deal with. The Qing Emperor smiled slightly. "I like this child more and more. This time I will see him again." Eunuch Hong sighed in his heart. Since he liked him, why continue to doubt and tempt him? How different was this from what he had done to the second prince in the past? The emperor stopped talking about the illegitimate child who had escaped. Turning to look at Eunuch Hong, he calmly said, "This time I will be relying on you." Eunuch Hong's body remained bent. After a moment of silence, he slowly said, "I am a servant of the Qing kingdom. Since the founding of the country, I have always hoped that the Qing court could unify the world. It is my good fortune to be able to serve the emperor." This was not an expression of loyalty. There was no need for such superfluous words between the emperor and an old eunuch. Even now, with the army surrounding the mountain, Eunuch Hong still spoke slowly. It was as if he urgently wanted to tell his thoughts to the emperor. The emperor looked calmly at Hong Xiang. The expression on his face gradually became serious. A moment later, he raised his hands in a salute and bowed toward Eunuch Hong. Given the emperor's supreme status, bowing to a eunuch was an unimaginable sight. However, Hong Xiang was unmoved. He calmly and even coldly accepted the bow. The emperor straightened his body. A determined expression rose to his face. "What I promised to you, to Qing kingdom, to the world. In the future I will let you see." The sky had long brightened. The thick fog had long dissipated. The rebel army camp was on a small slope behind a few rows of trees at the foot of Dong Mountain. The black-clothed commander of the rebel army calmly watched the activity outside the mountain gate. His calm gaze was filled with peace. There was not a glimmer of excitement. "No more attacks. It's useless." The black-clothed commander spoke calmly to the people beside him as if he was talking about a trivial family matter. His attitude was warm but left no room for doubt. Carrying a long sword on his back, Yun Zhilan glanced at this mysterious figure and furrowed his brows slightly. Although he didn't agree with the other party's judgment, he didn't say anything to refute it. The attack on Dong Mountain this time was like a thunderstorm that was destined to shake the world. As a master swordsman, Yun Zhilan didn't want to have any influence on the overall situation because of himself. It was quiet by the mountain gate. The remaining hundreds of imperial soldiers had already retreated behind the mountain gate. The 5,000 longbowmen of the rebel army had attacked several times but were completely beaten back by the defensive power in the mountain forest. The ones launching the attack this time were the attacking troops with the aces of Dongyi as the core. Yun Zhilan had great confidence in the strength of the disciples of the Sword Hut. He thought that with them leading the archers in a powerful attack, even if the Qing Emperor's most powerful tiger guards were hidden in the forest behind the mountain gate, they would still be torn open. Furthermore, the valiant disciple of the imperial army, when faced with his fellow disciples from Dongyi, was he going to continue attacking? In the morning the birds were startled. With a crash they charged out of the forest and tore off a few green leaves. One could imagine how frightened the birds were after a night of rest. What startled the birds was the snowy light that lit up the sky. Each piece of snow was a knife. A long knife that killed mercilessly. The snowy light filled the sky. No one knew how many soul-eating long knives danced at the same time to create such a bleak and terrifying scene. Knife chi crisscrossed through the forest. In an instant, it spilled out completely, invading the normally sturdy but now incomparably weak forest trees. Countless tree bark and tree trunks were shaved off and shot out with a pitter-patter. They hit the dirt with a thud. Countless muffled groans and wretched cries rang out in an instant. Blood sprayed freely in the forest. Broken limbs were thrown into the sky and fell toward the ground. It was the first time they had encountered a battle, yet it had progressed so wretchedly. It could be seen that when the knife-wielding men were forced into their final predicament, they had finally exploded with their most powerful strength. Yun Jilan's pupils constricted. He knew that the black-clothed commander's judgment was indeed correct. He didn't wait any longer. With a wave of his hand, he sent out an arrow of command. The aces of Dongyi led the remaining rebel soldiers and barely managed to retreat out of the forest in defeat. Looking at the situation, it would be more appropriate to call it a rout. In just a few breaths of time, the rebel soldiers attacking the mountain gate had suffered 70% of their casualties. Even the aces of Dongyi had lost 5 people. Yun Jilan's heart ached. He didn't know what to say. Dongyi did not have large numbers of soldiers like the Qing kingdom and northern Qi. Their most powerful force was the group of swordsmen raised by the sword hut. Even if only 5 people had died, it was still a heavy blow. He knew that the defensive power at the Qing emperor's side was terrifying, but he had never thought that the other party's mountain defense would be so powerful. It's the Tiger Guards. The black-clothed man on the horse looked at him and calmly said, "Legend has it that the 7 Tiger Guards at Sir Fan Jr.'s side working together can force Lady Haitang to retreat on this quiet Dong mountain." He smiled slightly. "There are 100 Tiger Guards. Other than the first experiment, this is the first time I've used the Qidian author system for a scheduled update. When I finished writing this paragraph, it was 9 o'clock in the morning. When everyone sees this chapter, it should be 4:50 in the afternoon. I'm already on a plane to Shanghai. Yes, Qidian is about to hold its annual writers' conference. There are many people like me in the country who are rushing in the direction of Shanghai. The conference will end on the 23rd, but I won't go home immediately because I have to go north. Because of the sentence before, devastatingly beautiful. Until the middle of July, my life will be on the road. The reason I didn't ask everyone for leave earlier is because I don't need to ask for leave. Haha, I used my monthly vote bonus to buy a book. I will keep updating. If I can't, I will definitely let everyone know ahead of time. However, because of the interference of many matters on the road, I don't dare to keep a stable time for updates. I ask for everyone's forgiveness for this. I was very satisfied with yesterday's chapter. It's not that I'm narcissistic. It's just that my ability and the effect I wrote were very consistent. Is there a problem? It's really nothing because there has never been an omniscient and omnipotent person in this world. I'm just a pitiful person writing. Rationality is not the key. It's more important to be self-consistent. It's basically impossible to write a novel every day without making mistakes. So, in this area I've always been very good at forgiving myself. I'm a person who treats myself very generously and treats others very generously. Of course, Fanxian is the hometown wish, but I'm not. I'm a good person. I'm at Ba. Just like the introduction in Zhukeji said, of course this is a YY novel. It's just a YY novel. Everyone reads it happily or passionately. I can pass some of my leisure time after work. That is the source of my sense of accomplishment. Chapter 534. The Great Dong Mountain was the most beautiful and strange mountain peak in the world. It faced the sea and had its back to the land. In front of it was a smooth jade-like cliff. Behind it was a green mountain forest nourished by fertile land. In people's rational thinking, it was impossible for anyone to go up or down from that smooth cliff. However, this record had been broken by the Qing commissioner the night before. The front of Dong Mountain was still dangerous. Other than a long set of stone steps that rose steeply into the clouds, there was no other path. If they wanted to forcefully attack, they could only follow this path. The narrowest place was often a place where one man held the pass and 10,000 could not pass. It could truly be said to be a dangerous place that was easy to defend and difficult to attack. The reason the rebel army had chosen to surround Dong Mountain was because they were thinking in reverse. Since the mountain was difficult to go up, if the army surrounded the mountain, it would also be difficult for the people on the mountain to come down. Up until now, the rebel army's control of the situation was very good. The Qing emperor's side had tried to break through the encirclement a number of times, but they had ruthlessly and mercilessly beaten them back. After beating them back to the mountain gate, the key points at the foot of Dong Mountain were all controlled by the rebel army. The rebel army had not thought that although they had surrounded it, they would not be able to take even half a step up the mountain. There were 100 Tiger Guards on Dong Mountain. If one were to do a simple math problem, it would take at least 14 Haitangs to be able to face these powerful Qing Emperor Guards head-on. In reality, there was only one Haitang in the entire world. Furthermore, beside the Tiger Guards was 13th Wang, who had some of the bravery and heroism in his stupidity that had long ceased to exist in this world. With such a powerful force of guards and the strange terrain of Dong Mountain, even if the rebel army elites had successfully surrounded the mountain, it would still be as difficult as climbing to the sky to forcefully attack and reach the top. It was just like the name of the long stone path, the stairway to heaven. If one wished to ascend to heaven, how could mortals do it? Thus, the commander of the rebel army shrouded in black decisively gave the order to pause all attacks. He only continued to strengthen the patrols and lockdowns around the foot of the mountain. After giving this order, he turned around and gently patted the back of his horse. Calmly, he said to Yun Jilan beside him, "At such a grand moment in history, people like you and me sometimes only have the right to be quiet spectators." This was an era where martial arts flourished. It was an era where the individual's strength was almost at the level of the heaven realm. 30 years ago, there had never been a great grandmaster in the world. It was only after the great grandmasters appeared that people realized that individual strength could be so powerful. Because of their strength, these great grandmasters could influence the world. It was also because of this that these great grandmasters often lived in seclusion. They were afraid that their words and actions would bring turmoil to the world and affect the lives and deaths of the people they wanted to protect. This place was the mysterious and beautiful Dong Mountain. At the summit was the Qing Emperor. It seemed that only a great grandmaster had the right to act. Once a great grandmaster made a move, those valiant generals who dominated a region and those great swordsmen who dominated the world would naturally retreat to the back. Their brilliance would be completely suppressed like a piece of coal that could not emit light. They could only hope to be qualified to witness history. Just like this moment. The long stone steps seemed to have no end. Very high up, one could faintly see the mountain mist drifting. A person wearing hemp clothing and a straw hat stood calmly on the first step of the stone steps at the foot of Dong Mountain. The stone steps were covered in blood. Some were dried and some were fresh. They carried all kinds of unpleasant smells. Who knew how many imperial soldiers and rebel soldiers had paid with their lives here for every inch of gain or loss? However, the person only stood calmly. It was as if he was not stepping on blood steps but white clouds. The mountain wind picked up. The person's figure was faintly discernible and lofty like an immortal. It was as if he wanted to ride the clouds up 3,000 feet. He didn't want to go to the heavenly palace. Instead, he wanted to go to the temple at the summit. When the person wearing the straw hat appeared on the first step, the two armies inside and outside the mountain fell silent at the same time. There wasn't even a cry of surprise. It was as if they were afraid of offending this figure. The black-clothed man and Yun Jilan, who had been sitting on their horses the entire time, quietly dismounted. They bowed slightly toward the back of the ordinary hemp-clothed figure to show respect. They knew that this figure had already come to the foot of the mountain last night, but they didn't know how he had appeared in front of them. However, they didn't need to be surprised. For such a person to appear in this world was the most inexplicable thing to begin with. The rebel soldiers did not make any more movements. After a moment of silence, the Tiger Guards, Imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council in the forest seemed to become flustered and helpless. No matter how loyal they were to the Emperor and their country, they had never thought of directly opposing this person, particularly the people of the Qing Kingdom. They had always seen this exceptional master, who liked to ride boats on the ocean, as the protector of the Qing Kingdom. However, this god was going to ascend the mountain in defiance of the Emperor's edict. Everyone knew what his goal was. The Tiger Guards became nervous. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council felt their mouths go dry. The Imperial soldiers were so shocked that they almost lost their grip on the weapons in their hands. To fight with a god was already beyond most people's imagination and mental limits. Furthermore, they knew that although the opponent was only one person, he was more terrifying than thousands of soldiers and horses. Even if he did not have a sword in his hand. Yi Luyun, wearing the straw hat, did not have a sword in his hand. No one knew if there was a sword in his heart. Last night, his sword had already pierced through the sometimes calm and sometimes angry ocean at the foot of Dong Mountain. It had pierced through layers of white waves, flattened a reef and injured Fan Xian's heart meridian. In the end, it had pierced with unstoppable killing into the rock wall that was harder than metal and stone. The entire sword had disappeared, leaving only a slightly protruding hilt in the rock wall. However, everyone under heaven knew that Great Grandmaster Yi Luyun was even more terrifying without a sword in his hand. In those legends, Yi Luyun resolutely abandoned his sword because of an unknown story. He comprehended flowing cloud hands in the clouds and entered the realm of a great grandmaster. Yi Luyun had already stepped onto the second stone step. Finally, the tiger guards hidden in the forest behind the mountain gate reacted. The first thing to welcome this great grandmaster up the mountain was the shrill and powerful rain of crossbow bolts. This was the Overwatch Council's weapon of mass destruction. It was the repeating crossbow that had once appeared on the southern plains of Zhangzhou. With such a short distance between them, who would be able to dodge it? The black-clothed man and Yun Jilan watched this scene from the distant flat ground outside the mountain gate without blinking. Of course, they were not worried about Yi Luyun's life or death. No one thought a mere rain of crossbow bolts would be able to stop a great grandmaster. They just didn't want to miss the scene of the great grandmaster, who usually appeared like a divine dragon, personally taking action. The black-clothed man thought to himself that if it was him facing such an urgent rain of crossbow bolts, he would probably be injured. Yun Jilan was thinking about how his teacher would respond. Yi Luyun faced the crossbow bolts that were about to strike his body and only waved his hand. This wave was like a mountain pine chasing the clouds, unwilling to have its beautiful appearance covered by the white fog. This wave was like a drop of rain piercing through the clouds, unwilling to have the black clouds cut off its chance to get close to the earth. The strangest feeling this wave gave everyone watching was that it was natural, gentle, determined, and fast. Two completely opposite attributes fused perfectly and vividly with this simple wave of his hand. Where the hand landed, the crossbow bolts gently fell to the ground. The crossbow bolts that shot out at high speed met that hand like clouds flying strangely slowly. They were slowly plucked off one by that hand and then thrown into the dust. The black-clothed man's heart chilled. In a quiet voice he said, "I can't see his hand clearly." Yun Jilan was silent. He had wanted to see which realm was higher between this Qin Kingdom great grandmaster and his teacher. Unexpectedly, he didn't understand anything. Given his and the mysterious black-clothed man's eyesight, they only understood one thing. The gentle Luyun released his hand so quickly that it could be used gently. Yet, no one was able to catch the trajectory of the fingertips. Not just fast. The man in black muttered to himself, "The cloud is in existence with the most shapes, so his hands are gentle yet terrifying." In Suzhou in Baoyue brothel, Yi Luyun had once used a pair of chopsticks to swat away Fan Xian's crossbow bolts like he was swatting away mosquitoes. Now, at the foot of the Great Dong Mountain Gate, his wave of one hand was even more ingenious. He walked up another step. The light of the knife shone brightly. In June, the stone path of Dong Mountain was like flying snow. The power of the snow headed straight for the straw hat. Countless tiger guards summoned their courage in this instant because of the responsibility and fear in their hearts and chose to attack at the same time. The long knives danced in the air. The power of the knife was enough to break the sky. It enveloped Yi Luyun's entire body. At the same time, such a powerful knife power layered on top of each other could completely chop Fan Xian and Haitang into pieces. However, it didn't hit Yi Luyun. On the stone path, there was only a twisted and unpleasant sound of metal scraping against each other. Yi Luyun's straw hat was still on his head, but his body was like a wisp of smoke. In an instant, he passed through the layers of knife light and suddenly came to the top of the stone steps, leaving the tiger guards behind him. He shook his arms and the two metal objects in his hands fell onto the stone steps. They rolled down more than a dozen steps with a crisp clang and then fell apart. It was only then that the crowd realized that the metal that looked like fried dough twists were actually long sabers slashed out by 6 or 7 tiger guards. Luyun was strong enough to bind gold and bind stones. After Great Grandmaster Yi Luyun perfectly displayed his realm that far surpassed the secular world, he stood quietly on the stone steps. Suddenly his body swayed. A corner of his hemp clothing was blown by the wind and left his clothes. A piece of hemp cloth floated up in the mountain wind and swirled above the stone steps. At some point, a young man with dried blood and clear eyes holding a green banner in his hand had appeared in front of him. 13th Wang. A gust of wind blew past. The layer of clouds covering the summit of the mountain seemed to be blown away, revealing an indistinct corner of the temple. A muffled sound came from the stone steps. Yi Luyun pulled back his hand and lowered his head to look at the broken green banner by his feet. A glimmer of confusion and a smile flashed through his calm eyes. He then coughed. 13th Wang was still flying in the air. Fresh blood sprayed out habitually. His body drew a long arc as he fell dejectedly into the forest, smashing heavily into a large tree far to the right of the stone steps. Even a 9th-level ace was not a match for a great grandmaster. Yi Luyun coughed. A glimmer of worry flashed through the black-clothed man's eyes. He knew that after Yi Luyun had seemingly defeated the tiger guards and the powerful young 9th-level ace, he was still affected. He knew that given the great grandmaster's realm, he should not be injured. However, Yi Luyun had purposely left some leeway in his 3 attacks. Faced with the Qing Emperor's subordinates and aces whose eyes were red with fear and anger, there would always be some problems. The great grandmasters were the people closest to gods. After all, they were not gods. They had their own countries, particularly Yi Luyun. Even though he had come to commit regicide for his family, he was still so gentle that he would not harm the people of the Qing kingdom. Then, he saw the piece of hemp cloth on the great grandmaster's robe gently float down and land in front of him. His steed was curious and went to sniff it. Chapter 535. At the summit of Dong Mountain, the morning fog had already dispersed. The mountain wind blew strongly. The clouds parted, and the true appearance of the temple appeared. Dressed in a bright yellow dragon robe, the Qing emperor stood quietly by the railing, waiting for Yi Luyun's arrival. When the foot of the mountain was surrounded by 5,000 longbowmen, particularly when traces of Dongyi's 9th-level aces appeared among the rebel soldiers, the Qing emperor, who had always calculated everything, seemed to have finally realized that for the first time, the situation was beginning to get out of his control. A faint worry rose between the middle-aged man's brows. A bell rang out in the group of old temples with round black eaves. It refreshed the mind and moved the soul. It calmed one's mind and made the world restless. The edict used for the worship to heaven burned in the furnace. Green smoke rose in spirals. The various crimes of the crown prince that the Qing emperor had listed seemed to have already been offered to the illusory temple and the even more illusory will of heaven. The Qing emperor's most important mission had been completed during the worship to heaven. All he needed to do was bring the groundless revelation from heaven back to Jingdo, depose the crown prince, and then pick a suitable successor. A straw hat slowly crossed the line of the last stone step at the summit of Dong Mountain and suddenly appeared in front of the group of Qing officials in front of the temple. The emperor looked calmly in that direction. He looked at the simple and unremarkable face under the straw hat. He looked at the clear and gentle eyes like autumn water. Slowly he said, "Uncle Luyun, you're late." Yi Luyun walked up the mountain step by step. No one could stop him. He faced the temple quietly and didn't speak for a long time. The officials and priests on the summit, including the minister of the Board of Rites and Ren Xiao, and all unconsciously lowered their bodies and bowed to this great grandmaster of the Qing kingdom. In front of Yi Luyun, only the Qing emperor stood as straight as usual. Although old eunuch Hong, who never left his side, was hunched over, everyone knew that this old eunuch was always hunched over. It was as if he was watching ants walk on the ground. It was not because he wanted to show respect to Yi Luyun. "How can you say I'm late?" Yi Luyun looked at the emperor and sighed. His tone was filled with indescribable helplessness and regret. "Has your majesty received the mandate of heaven on this journey to worship heaven?" "The will of heaven is upon me. Since I am not afraid of hardships and dangers, I have traveled thousands of li to come to Dong Mountain. Naturally, my wishes will come true," the emperor said coldly. Yi Luyun slightly lowered his head and thought for a moment before saying, "Something like destiny is always hard to fathom. Although your majesty isn't an ordinary person, you shouldn't rashly mete out punishment on behalf of heaven." The emperor looked coldly at Yi Luyun, who was over 100 feet away, and said, "Uncle, are you here today just to admonish me and not to vent the anger of the heavens?" Yi Luyun laughed bitterly as he slowly raised his right arm. The cuffs of his sleeves were slightly pulled back, revealing his spotless right hand. His fingers were smooth and clean, definitely not a limb that an old man should have. His right hand pointed at the pool of blood in front of the Qing temple, as well as the Qing temple priests in the pool of blood. "Your Majesty, you're the one who's angry," Yi Luyun said compassionately. "The priests are the ascetic monks who serve the temple. Even they know that His Majesty's sacrifice to the heavens is a random order. The ruler has a random order that officials cannot accept, and the sacrifice cannot be accepted. That is why you killed them." The crown prince's edict for the emperor's sacrifice to the heavens came from the hands of the internal court. The chosen crimes were only vague matters such as salivation, having a concubine, and misconduct. This was what the crown prince had done many years ago. It was completely different from the steady and filial crown prince now. In all the previous dynasties and generations of deposed crown princes, there had never been such a muddle-headed edict, such as a ridiculous sacrifice to the heavens. The Qing temple on Dong Mountain had a long history. Although it was not in Jingdo, the Qing temple priests often cultivated there. Following the great priest's strange death and the second priest's great master Sansher's death from an arrow, the Qing temple's power, which had already been weakened beyond recognition by the Qing emperor, became even weaker. Thus, all the way from the mountain gate to the mountain, the priests of the Qing temple on Dong Mountain appeared humble and obedient. When the Qing emperor formally began the process of offering sacrifices to the heavens to denounce the crown prince, there were still some priests who bravely stood out and expressed their opposition with vehement words. They also solemnly pointed out that the Qing temple would never become a sharp blade in the hands of an incapable emperor. The court's secret encroachment on the Qing temple and the deaths of the two leading priests made the priests of the Qing temple on Dong Mountain feel boundless anger. The arrival of the rebel army at the foot of the mountain gave these people boundless courage. Thus, these priests became a few corpses in front of the Black Eve's temple. Their courage became a puddle of blood that attracted flies. When someone disobeyed the emperor's edict, he was never afraid to kill them, even if they were the priests on Dong Mountain. The only people the Qing emperor didn't dare kill were those he temporarily couldn't, such as Yi Luyun. The emperor calmly watched Yi Luyun by the stone steps and said, "Uncle, you are not a foolish commoner. You know that these priests are only mortals. Even if I kill them, what does that have to do with the will of heaven?" Yi Luyun furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Even if the priests are mortals, this temple is not ordinary. Presumably, your majesty knows better than me. When you kill people at the front door of the temple and the blood flows into the steps, are you not worried about heaven's wrath?" The emperor's expression was indifferent. He placed his hands behind his back. A moment later he said each word clearly, "You and I live in this world, but it is not the end of heaven. Thus in my life I have never respected ghosts or gods. I only respect you, uncle." Yi Luyun was silent and speechless. The emperor turned his body and calmly looked at the black eaves of the temple. The old tiles on the eaves shone with a solemn luster under the morning sun. "Thus, I have invited an old friend to meet you." There were not many people in this world who had the right to be called Yi Luyun's old friend by the Qing emperor. There were only a handful of them. When the bell of the Qing temple rang out again and the wooden door to the side courtyard creaked open, a gust of mountain wind swept past the summit. Wu Zhu, with a piece of black cloth tied around his neck, walked out from inside the door. Yi Luyun only smiled. Of course, there was an additional hint of emotion and bitterness in his smile. "It has been many years since we parted in Danzhou. I haven't heard news of you for over 2 years. He gazed at Wu Zhu and amiably said, "I had thought you had already returned. I didn't expect you to be on Dong Mountain." In the summer of 2 years ago, the Northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He had been injured in a secret duel. As one of the 4 great grandmasters, Yi Luyun could guess that the one who had done it was Wu Zhu. That was why he had said that he hadn't heard news of you for over 2 years. Yi Luyun's words, "I thought you had already returned," hid too much of his meaning. However, other than him and Wu Zhu, perhaps no one else in this world could understand. Fan Xian was far away on the cliff in Danzhou and did not hear the conversation at the bottom of the cliff. Wu Zhu, as usual, was neat and tidy. After saying these 2 words, he stood at the door to the little courtyard and didn't take another step toward the scene. He faced Yi Luyun from a distance, but he was closer to the emperor. The 2 words he said were, "Hello." It was just these 2 words, but they shocked Yi Luyun even more than when he had come out of the courtyard. He was even more moved. He couldn't help but laugh in a comforting manner. The laughter was very sincere. Then the laughter suddenly stopped. Yi Luyun turned to face the emperor and bowed slightly. He sighed in admiration and said, "Your Majesty's foresight is divine. No wonder there was a trip to Dong Mountain for the heaven worship. Even this strange creature was dug out by you. Even if I didn't want to admire you, I had no choice." Hearing these words, the emperor's expression did not change at all. On the contrary, the corners of his brows twitched a little. Yes, the heaven worship had always been a trap targeted at Yi Luyun. When Wu Zhu, the vanguard of the trap, stood out, Yi Luyun did not react as if he had fallen into the trap. A glimmer of worry flashed through the emperor's eyes and then disappeared. Presumably, he knew that the major event he and Fan Xian guessed was finally about to become reality. The emperor glanced at old eunuch Hong beside him. His gaze was calm, but it contained many meanings. It was as if he was asking why he didn't immediately act. Given the great grandmaster's realm, even if it was 2 against 1, if they couldn't seize the moment earlier when Yi Luyun's guard had loosened because of Wu Zhu's mysterious appearance, it would still be a difficult task to kill Yi Luyun on the mountain. Eunuch Hong completely ignored the emperor's gaze. His gaze was unusually hot as it stared forward. It passed through Yi Luyun's shoulders and shot straight into the mountain forest below the stone steps. He took half a step forward and stood in front of the emperor's body. He then slowly straightened his body. Eunuch Hong, who seemed to have been bent over his entire life, suddenly straightened his body. It was this simple change in action. An indescribable aura began to surge into his body and spread out with unusual majesty toward the summit of the mountain. Everyone knew that Eunuch Hong's body had not grown larger. In this instant, everyone had the illusion that Eunuch Hong had become an undefeatable god. His entire body gave off a piercing light that completely covered the Qing Emperor behind him. The strength of this wave of Jinqi had even faintly surpassed the limits of what a mortal's physical body could contain. It was extremely tyrannical. The endless falling trees rustled down, and the endless great river surged forth. This was the first poem Fan Xian had copied in Jingdo. Regardless of whether the characters for the great river were appropriate or not, this poem had already spread throughout the world. The people who were lucky or unlucky to be on Dong Mountain all thought of the first half of this poem in an instant. This was because they sensed a surge of sword qi that soared into the sky, wreaking havoc in the forest below the stone steps. Even the distant mountain peaks were invaded by this extremely fierce sword qi. The green trees began to shed their leaves for no reason, and the fallen leaves formed a green pile. Yi Luyun looked at Eunuch Hong and said, "You are a beautiful person. How can you be a slave?" Eunuch Hong's silver-white hair floated in the wind. In a raspy voice he said, "Great grandmasters are all slaves. I am the emperor's slave. You are also nothing more than slaves of this world. What is the difference?" Chapter 536. In this moment, Gauda thought he was flying. He flew past the layers of green forest on the mountainside of Dong Mountain, the faint mist in the forest and the swiftly flying crossbow bolts. He flew higher and higher. The higher he flew, the further he could see. In that instant, Gauda saw the mountain gate at the foot of the mountain. He saw the long stone path, the blood stains on the green stone slabs, the flashing knife light in the forest, and the snake-like shadow of a sword beside the stone path. Then he fell heavily, breaking who knows how many twigs. He hit the wet ground of the forest with a thud, and almost fell off the steep mountain bank. Gauda gave a muffled grunt and used the Jinqi in his body to forcefully resist this attack. His entire body bounced up like a spring. His hands gripped the hilt of the long knife tightly. Raising his foot, he prepared to charge toward the stone path of death again. Then, with one movement, he felt all the bones in his body shatter at the same time. A muffled grunt came from his nose. The pain was unbearable. At the same time, 2 streams of blood seeped out of his nose. Gauda's legs weakened. He unconsciously turned his hand and stabbed the long knife into the ground beside him to support his body. Unexpectedly, the moment the tip of the knife touched the muddy ground, it shattered into countless pieces of metal in an instant. Amidst the crisp clanging sounds, Gauda fell wretchedly into the muddy ground in the forest. Beside him were pieces of the knife. In his hand, he held the pitiful remnants of the knife hilt. His eyes were filled with shock and terror. He had been sent flying by a person and a sword. As Fan Xian's personal guard, Gauda had the strength of an 8th-level martial artist. Back in the northern Qi Palace, he had forced back the enemy with one strike. How impressive was that? Even among the tiger guards of the palace, he was one of the few aces. Unexpectedly, he had been sent flying by a sword like he was swatting a mosquito. Gauda's gaze was complicated as he looked at the sword light on the distant stone path. His heart darkened. This time, Fan Xian had brought 7 of the tiger guards to Danzhou. Unexpectedly, they had been brought to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Then they encountered the assassination attempt. As a tiger guard, their first duty was to protect the emperor's safety. Although Gauda didn't know that Sir Fan Jr. had already quietly slipped down the cliff, he still led the other 6 tiger guards and joined the group of palace guards. They began to carry out the most merciless killing on this precipitous stone path. 100 tiger guards guarded a mountain path. Logically speaking, there were no aces in the world who could break through and ascend the mountain. However, in this world there were always a few existences that did not abide by logic. For example, the great grandmaster of the Qing kingdom, Yi Luyun, who had turned into a flowing cloud and passed by, or the person holding a sword in his hand and killing gods on the stone path. His sword intent had already reached a peak. Gauda swallowed the sweet saliva in his mouth and forcefully calmed his breathing. As he listened to the sounds on the stone path grow softer and softer, he knew that his brothers had probably already died at the hands of that great grandmaster. The most basic requirement to be a tiger guard was loyalty to the emperor. Even though they knew that they were facing the strongest power in the world, they still resolutely stood on the stone path and stood in front of the emperor. Their blood splashed and their chests were cut open. They risked their lives and did not take a single step back. Therefore the Gundam, at this moment, its first reaction was to charge forward again and block the path of that terrifying big shot, becoming another wandering soul under the other party's sword. Even if he was already heavily injured and his knife had been shattered into small pieces. However, the Gundam hesitated for a moment. On the long and bloody stone path, countless tiger guards tried to surround the figure with 7 people and used the methods they used to deal with 9th-level aces in their daily training to deal with that figure. However, all of their efforts were futile. The sword that seemed to have come from the netherworld and carried an indomitable aura was only gently waved and suffused with a heavy murderous aura as it sliced through people's knives, arms and heads. The reason Gauda was still alive after flying over was because he had been influenced too much by Fan Xian these 2 years. Involuntarily, his murderous long knife carried the dark imprint of Fan Xian's little tricks. He no longer blindly killed and did not retreat a single step. Even when facing that figure, Gauda was still not his match. His meridians were about to be torn apart by the sword intent, but he still survived. Since he had survived, was he still going to send himself to death? No. A strange light flashed through Gauda's eyes. Sir Fan Jr. had said countless times that no matter what, he had to first keep his life before he had a chance to redeem it. The Great Dong Mountain was surrounded. If he charged over again and died on the stone path, it would be useless. He covered his mouth with his hand and allowed the blood to flow out between his fingers. He didn't make a single sound. He gazed at the bottom of the forest. It was clear that the rebel army's defensive circle had relaxed a little because of the arrival of 2 figures in succession. Gauda gritted his teeth. His eyes were filled with determination. He decided to find an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. From the moment he made this decision, he was no longer just a tiger guard of the royal family. He had not thought that his decision would bring so much shock to the world 2 years later. Drip, drip. The drop of blood slowly fell. It was a very small sound, but it was ear-piercing. It made the people present feel that the sound of the dripping blood was even more cleansing than the sound of the bell in the old temple behind them. The drop of blood was dripping from the tip of a sword. This sword slowly rose and passed the last stone step, appearing in front of the eyes of the people on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword was very normal and didn't look strange. Even the hilt was casually tied with a layer of hemp rope. It looked a bit old and worn. However, it was precisely this ordinary sword that did not reflect much light on the surface of the sword that shone with a trace of power and coldness that made everyone feel fear. Especially when the blood on the sword slowly gathered at the tip of the sword and then slowly fell down. It was as if everyone who saw this sword felt as if the blood at the tip of their hearts was flowing out of their bodies through this process. Their faces all paled. Then he saw the hand that held the sword, the person. The person wearing a straw hat and hemp clothing was not very tall. On the contrary, he appeared to be a bit short. He was the complete opposite of Yi Liuyun's confident and untainted image. Because this figure was short, his hemp clothing was in tatters, and his entire body was covered in dust and blood from the tears in his clothing. In his hand he held a blood-stained, worn-out sword. He appeared incomparably wretched. However, no one laughed because of this wretched feeling. They knew that when this figure killed, he was ruthless. In terms of terror, he was even more terrifying than Yi Liyun. Old eunuch Hong looked calmly at the wretched swordsman ascending the steps and smiled slightly. He then slowly withdrew the tyrannical aura he had released. His entire body bent down and returned to the appearance of an old eunuch. The Qing Emperor looked at the stone steps with a cold expression. He looked at Yi Liyun and the newcomer and took a gentle step forward. Calmly he said, "Looks like Yunrui has invested a lot this time. However, uncle, are you going crazy with her? Betraying the country for the sake of the family is truly unexpected." Since that terrifying figure was standing with Yi Liyun, it meant that the most powerful old creatures had already joined hands and made a decision. They could not allow the most powerful emperor since the founding of the Qing kingdom to continue living. Yi Liyun smiled warmly. He didn't explain or defend himself. Ever since that terrifying figure holding a sword had come up the cliff, everyone had been silent, terrified of disturbing that person. However, the Qing emperor was not afraid at all. He smiled coldly as he stared at the hemp clothing full of holes. Mockingly he said, "Sigujin, what are you doing on Dong Mountain instead of retiring in the grass hut? Look at your wretched appearance. You killed all of my tiger guards. Did you think you wouldn't have to pay a price? An idiot is an idiot. The Qing kingdom cured your insanity. It's fine if you don't think about repaying the favor, but you insist on using your sword to kill your way up the mountain and waste your jinchi. It looks like after all these years your brain hasn't gotten any better. A short man with a broken sword and wretched clothes had killed his way up the endless stone steps and killed hundreds of tiger guards. In the entire world there was only Sigujien, who only cared about what was in front and not behind, who pressed forward with an indomitable sword intent, and who single-handedly protected Dongyi and the small vassal states for 20 years. No one dared to be disrespectful to Sigujien. Only the Qing emperor dared to speak to him in such a tone. However, when these mocking words fell into the ears of those who paid attention, they heard a hint of being strong in appearance but weak in heart. No one dared to not reply to the Qing emperor's question. However, Sigujien couldn't even be bothered to glance at the Qing emperor. He only stared in a daze at old eunuch Hong beside the emperor. Gradually the great grandmaster's gaze grew hot. It was as if they were going to pierce through the shadow under the straw hat and melt old eunuch Hong's old face. The short Sigujien opened his mouth. His voice was not like his body. It was as loud as a large bell. His voice could split pine, but it trembled with excitement. It was you just now, wasn't it? What tyrannical Jinchi. Sigujien looked at old eunuch Hong in a daze. I know Fan Xian also walks this path. So you are his teacher. Speaking of which, the person who showed power in the royal palace in Jingdo a dozen years ago was you. The rumors under heaven are indeed reasonable. The Qing emperor was ignored by this great grandmaster. Although the emperor did not get angry, his gaze gradually became icy. Looking at Sigujien, he said, You have tried to assassinate me 3 times. You didn't even see my face before retreating miserably. Is there some unexpected joy this time? It seemed that Sigujien had only just heard the Qing emperor's words. His gaze shifted slightly and looked at the Qing emperor's face. After a moment of silence, he suddenly shook his head. You are far less handsome than your son. What is there to look at? The emperor smiled slightly and said, Naturally, I am talking about Enji. Have you seen him? Sigujien tilted his head and said, I have a female disciple called LVCC. Her senior sister disciple was clearly killed by Fan Xian, but after seeing Fan Xian from afar in Hangzhou, she forgot her grudge and became infatuated. Every day she holds up some Bang Xian's high book and reads it. Speaking of which, Fan Xian, that pretty boy, is not bad. The sea breeze blew gently through the summit of the mountain. The Qing emperor laughed loudly and said, You Dongyi people are indeed all infatuated. Sigujien thought for a moment and then said seriously, I am an idiot. My little disciple is even more of an idiot. My disciple is infatuated. This is as it should be. Then this seemingly idiotic great grandmaster suddenly looked at the Qing emperor and said, When it comes to governing and fighting, I am not as good as you. There are not many in the world who are more powerful than you. Thus I must respect you. I hope you don't mind my rudeness just now. Sir is too polite. The emperor seemed to be intoxicated and bowed slightly. Then the emperor and Sigujien laughed loudly at the same time. Even the increasingly strong sea breeze could not stop the sound of the laughter from spreading. Sigujien's laughter was naturally imbued with extremely pure Jinchi, so it broke through the wind without any hindrance. However, the emperor's laughter was unhindered by the heroic spirit he had cultivated for a long time as the ruler of the world. The laughter abruptly stopped and there was an awkward silence. It seemed that both sides did not know how to continue this absurd play. To kill or to be killed, this was a question and not a long play that needed to be talked about, told history and told stories. Why had the Qing emperor and Sigujien clumsily performed this scene earlier? The Qing emperor slowly put his hands behind his back and sighed. He no longer looked at the 2 great grandmasters on the stone steps. Calmly he said, I had followed Yunrui's intentions and followed her plan, intending to keep uncle here. Unexpectedly, Yunrui's plan was so crazy that she disregarded the safety of the country and tied Dongyi and northern Qi to her chariot. He turned his head without a trace of fear. Calmly, he looked at the shadow under Sigujien's straw hat and said, Great grandmasters have not appeared in the world for a long time. When they do, they will shake the world. Since the 2 of you have come here today, naturally you must succeed. Although I am not afraid of death, I do not want to die. Thus I have no choice but to delay. I truly do not know why you are also delaying with me for so long. Sigujien was silent for a moment. His wrist hung down naturally. Appearing somewhat ill at ease, he smiled strangely and said, Why am I so interested in this eunuch? Of the 4 strange creatures in the world, the 3 of us can all be considered divine friends. Only this eunuch likes to hide in the palace. It is because I understand Yi Luyun that I know his personality. If possible, he would act alone and not wait for us outsiders to interfere with the internal affairs of the Qing kingdom. Sigujien calmed down and respectfully said to old eunuch Hong, even if eunuch was here, Yi Luyun would still act. He said one last sentence to explain the Qing emperor's question. Yi Luyun has his reasons for not acting. Thus, I can only see why he hasn't acted immediately. Yi Luyun smiled gently and turned his body to face Sigujien. Foolish sword, do you still not feel it at this time? Sigujien's body was short, so the straw hat on his head appeared particularly large. The shadow completely covered his face. Even though the shadow was heavy, the people on the summit seemed to see the trace of a bitter smile at the corners of this great grandmaster's lips and a strange expression on his face. Everyone's hearts jumped. They wondered what kind of discovery would make Sigujien, who had always viewed swords as an idiot and killed people like grass, quiet for so long. Sigujien turned and directly faced the door of the old temple behind everyone. He raised his sword and bowed. After a moment of silence he said, I truly don't understand. Why have you come to join in on the lousy matters of the world? The officials and priests who were seen by Sigujien were terrified and quickly moved away, terrified of being touched by his gaze. Following Sigujien's gaze, the people parted to make a path, revealing the black wooden door of the old temple at the very end. Outside the door was Wu Zhu, who was dressed entirely in black and seemed to have become one with the temple. Sigujien's gaze pierced through the air like two swords and landed on Wu Zhu's clean face and the black cloth that seemed to never be tainted by dust. However, Wu Zhu was unmoved and did not have any reaction. Sigujien sighed. The Qing emperor laughed again. This time his laughter was more natural. If you can come, why can't Lao Wu? The emperor's smile faded and he looked coldly at Sigujien. Yi Luyun smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said to Sigujien, when the mountain was surrounded, Fan Xian was on the mountain. Naturally he also came. Sigujien paused. This great grandmaster had never cared about the specific process of surrounding the mountain. After pausing for a moment, he suddenly let loose a torrent of abuse. He completely disregarded a great grandmaster's aura and dignity. A string of curses went on for several breaths, using all the obscenities he could think of. F***C. Yun Jilan and Yen Xiaoyi, those two idiots. Why did they surround that pretty boy on the mountain? Sigujien scolded as he panted for breath. Are they trying to kill me? His expression suddenly froze. He looked coldly at the Qing emperor and mockingly said, You brought Fan Xian up the mountain and found such a good helper. No wonder you're not afraid at all. Looks like I was wrong earlier. I'm not as good as you in governing and military. I am even less capable of squeezing my own children and family. The Qing emperor smiled slightly and didn't say anything. It was clear that regardless of whether it was Sigujien or Yi Luyun, they both felt great shock and wariness toward Wu Zhu, who had suddenly appeared in the Qing temple at the summit of Dong Mountain. Although they were great grandmasters, past history and the miraculous happenings of this world had already proven many things. Otherwise, Sigujien would not have sent 13th Wang to Fan Xian's side and thrown out his last disciple, whose personality was most similar to his but was particularly gentle. Was it not because of this blind man? Sigujien suddenly looked at Wu Zhu and quietly said, Don't get involved in this matter. Go down the mountain. This emperor is not a good person. Us old fellows will give you a guarantee. Fan Xian will live a glorious life. Even if he doesn't stay in the Qing kingdom and goes to Dongyi, I will have him be the master of the city. Everyone present remained silent, but expressions of shock and terror began to appear in their eyes. They didn't know who the black-clothed man standing at the temple door was to be able to make two great grandmasters stop in the instant before they assassinated the emperor and to make Sigujien, the always ruthless Sigujien, make such a large promise. No one would disbelieve the words of a great grandmaster. Thus, everyone was even more curious about the black-clothed man who was closely related to Sir Fan Jr. The emperor's brows furrowed slightly. He found that Wu Zhu had his head lowered as if thinking about something. Wu Zhu thought for a moment and then slowly said, Apologies, Fan Xian asked me to protect the emperor's life. Like Yi Luyun, Sigujien also opened his mouth wide and sank into an expression of shock that was even greater than when he saw Wu Zhu. A moment later, he shook his head and said, After 30 years, who would have thought you'd become so talkative? If I didn't know it was you, I would have thought you were being impersonated. Wu Zhu shook his head and couldn't be bothered to reply to such a senseless question. Sigujien adjusted the straw hat on his head and said, Wu Zhu, we were friends back then. Unless I had no other choice, I didn't want to attack you. You have to know, in the 2 years after Nyilan Mountain, I had tolerated Fan Xian for a long time. Everyone was shocked again and wondered what the friendship back then was. Wu Zhu was slightly startled. He thought for a moment and then quietly said, "At that time your snot was on the ground. It was so dirty." Sigu Jian laughed loudly. "I'm just as dirty now. I'm still that idiot with a runny nose when I was a teenager. How about it? Do you want to squat with me again?" The corners of Wu Zhu's mouth twitched as if he wanted to smile. In the end he didn't. He only shook his head. Sigu Jian was silent for a long time. He then shook his head and put his sword back into the sheath by his side. Yi Luyun asked in surprise, "What?" Sigu Jian pointed at old eunuch Hong and Wu Zhu. He then looked at Yi Luyun and said without good humor, "2 against 2. Only an idiot would attack." Yi Luyun said with a pained expression, "But you, aren't you an idiot?" "I am an idiot," Sigu Jian said seriously. "But I'm not crazy." Everyone present, including the Qing officials, priests and a few eunuchs, was seeing these legendary figures for the first time. They were seeing the great grandmasters who were like gods in the hearts of humans. After the initial respect and fear, countless absurd feelings grew in their hearts as they watched the conversation. Were these old men who bickered like children the great grandmasters who had secretly influenced the situation under heaven for 20 years? The emperor watched this scene and waited for the curtain to fall on the drama. His heart was calm. If Sigu Jian and Yi Luyun truly retreated, this drama would become a farce. Sigu Jian was not truly an idiot. He knew what terrifying consequences it would bring if he allowed the Qing emperor to return to Jingdo alive. Sigu Jian yelled at the top of his voice, "In any case I won't fight 2 against 2. If that bastard still doesn't come out, I will immediately go down the mountain." Hearing these words, the emperor's pupils constricted. His expression grew cold. Clouds rose and fell at the waist of the mountain. Heavenly swords pierced through the stone paths. Fallen leaves drifted with the wind. The wind passed and the light scattered. In a flash, a third person wearing a straw hat floated to the top of the mountain like a fallen leaf. Kui had finally come. Chapter 537. In this moment, Gauda thought he was flying. He flew past the layers of green forest on the mountainside of Dong Mountain, the faint mist in the forest and the swiftly flying crossbow bolts. He flew higher and higher. The higher he flew, the further he could see. In that instant, Gauda saw the mountain gate at the foot of the mountain. He saw the long stone path, the blood stains on the green stone slabs, the flashing knife light in the forest, and the snake-like shadow of a sword beside the stone path. Then he fell heavily, breaking who knows how many twigs. He hit the wet ground of the forest with a thud, and almost fell off the steep mountain bank. Gauda gave a muffled grunt and used the jinshi in his body to forcefully resist this attack. His entire body bounced up like a spring. His hands gripped the hilt of the long knife tightly. Raising his foot, he prepared to charge toward the stone path of death again. Then, with one movement, he felt all the bones in his body shatter at the same time. A muffled grunt came from his nose. The pain was unbearable. At the same time, 2 streams of blood seeped out of his nose. Gauda's legs weakened. He unconsciously turned his hand and stabbed the long knife into the ground beside him to support his body. Unexpectedly, the moment the tip of the knife touched the muddy ground, it shattered into countless pieces of metal in an instant. Amidst the crisp clanging sounds, Gauda fell wretchedly into the muddy ground in the forest. Beside him were pieces of the knife. In his hand, he held the pitiful remnants of the knife hilt. His eyes were filled with shock and terror. He had been sent flying by a person and a sword. As Fan Xian's personal guard, Gauda had the strength of an 8th-level martial artist. Back in the northern Qi Palace, he had forced back the enemy with one strike. How impressive was that? Even among the tiger guards of the palace, he was one of the few aces. Unexpectedly, he had been sent flying by a sword like he was swatting a mosquito. Gauda's gaze was complicated as he looked at the sword light on the distant stone path. His heart darkened. This time, Fan Xian had brought 7 of the tiger guards to Danzhou. Unexpectedly, they had been brought to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Then they encountered the assassination attempt. As a tiger guard, their first duty was to protect the emperor's safety. Although Gauda didn't know that Sir Fan Jr. had already quietly slipped down the cliff, he still led the other 6 tiger guards and joined the group of palace guards. They began to carry out the most merciless killing on this precipitous stone path. 100 tiger guards guarded a mountain path. Logically speaking, there were no aces in the world who could break through and ascend the mountain. However, in this world there were always a few existences that did not abide by logic. For example, the great grandmaster of the Qing kingdom, Yi Luyun, who had turned into a flowing cloud and passed by, or the person holding a sword in his hand and killing gods on the stone path. His sword intent had already reached a peak. Gauda swallowed the sweet saliva in his mouth and forcefully calmed his breathing. As he listened to the sounds on the stone path grow softer and softer, he knew that his brothers had probably already died at the hands of that great grandmaster. The most basic requirement to be a tiger guard was loyalty to the emperor. Even though they knew that they were facing the strongest power in the world, they still resolutely stood on the stone path and stood in front of the emperor. Their blood splashed and their chests were cut open. They risked their lives and did not take a single step back. Therefore the Gundam, at this moment, its first reaction was to charge forward again and block the path of that terrifying big shot, becoming another wandering soul under the other party's sword. Even if he was already heavily injured and his knife had been shattered into small pieces. However, the Gundam hesitated for a moment. On the long and bloody stone path, countless tiger guards tried to surround the figure with 7 people and used the methods they used to deal with 9th-level aces in their daily training to deal with that figure. However, all of their efforts were futile. The sword that seemed to have come from the netherworld and carried an indomitable aura was only gently waved and suffused with a heavy murderous aura as it sliced through people's knives, arms and heads. The reason Gauda was still alive after flying over was because he had been influenced too much by Fan Xian these 2 years. Involuntarily, his murderous long knife carried some of the dark imprints of Fan Xian's little tricks. He was no longer blindly murderous and did not retreat a single step. Even when facing that figure, Gauda was still not his match. His meridians were about to be torn apart by the sword intent, but he still survived. Since he had survived, was he still going to send himself to death? No. A strange light flashed through Gauda's eyes. Sir Fan Jr. had said countless times that no matter what, he had to first keep his life before he had a chance to redeem it. The Great Dong Mountain was surrounded. If he charged over again and died on the stone path, it would be useless. He covered his mouth with his hand and allowed the blood to flow out between his fingers. He didn't make a single sound. He gazed at the bottom of the forest. It was clear that the rebel army's defensive circle had relaxed a little because of the arrival of 2 figures in succession. Gauda gritted his teeth. His eyes were filled with determination. He decided to find an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. From the moment he made this decision, he was no longer just a tiger guard of the royal family. He had not thought that this decision of his would bring so much shock to the world 2 years later. Drip, drip. The drop of blood slowly fell. It was a very small sound, but it was ear-piercing. It even made the people present feel that the sound of the dripping blood was even more cleansing than the sound of the bell in the old temple behind them. The drop of blood was dripping from the tip of a sword. This sword slowly rose and passed the last stone step, appearing in front of the eyes of the people on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword was very normal and didn't look strange. Even the hilt was casually tied with a layer of hemp rope. It looked a bit old and worn. However, it was precisely this ordinary sword that did not reflect much light on the surface of the sword that shone with a trace of power and coldness that made everyone feel fear. Especially when the blood on the sword slowly gathered at the tip of the sword and then slowly fell down. It was as if everyone who saw this sword felt as if the blood at the tip of their hearts was flowing out of their bodies through this process. Therefore their faces turned pale. Then he saw the hand that held the sword, the person. The person wearing a straw hat and hemp clothing was not very tall. On the contrary, he appeared to be a bit short. He was the complete opposite of Yi Liuyun's confident and untainted image. Because this figure was short, his hemp clothing was in tatters, and his entire body was covered in dust and blood from the tears in his clothing. In his hand he held a blood-stained, worn-out sword. He appeared incomparably wretched. However, no one laughed because of this wretched feeling. They knew that when this figure killed, he was ruthless. In terms of terror, he was even more terrifying than Yi Luyun. Old eunuch Hong looked calmly at the wretched swordsman ascending the steps and smiled slightly. He then slowly withdrew the tyrannical aura he had released. His entire body bent down and returned to the appearance of an old eunuch. The Qing emperor looked at the stone steps with a cold expression. He looked at Yi Luyun and the newcomer and took a gentle step forward. Calmly he said, "Looks like Yunrui has invested a lot this time. However, uncle, are you going crazy with her? Betraying the country for the sake of the family is truly unexpected." Since that terrifying figure was standing with Yi Luyun, it meant that the most powerful old creatures had already joined hands and made a decision. They could not allow the most powerful emperor since the founding of the Qing kingdom to continue living. Yi Luyun smiled warmly. He didn't explain or defend himself. Ever since that terrifying figure holding a sword had come up the cliff, Everyone had been silent, terrified of disturbing that person. However, the Qing Emperor was not afraid at all. He smiled coldly as he stared at the hemp clothing full of holes. Mockingly he said, "Sigujien, what are you doing on Dong Mountain instead of retiring in the grass hut? Look at your wretched appearance. You killed all of my tiger guards. Did you think you wouldn't have to pay a price? An idiot is an idiot. The Qing kingdom cured your insanity. It's fine if you don't think about repaying the favor, but you insist on using your sword to kill your way up the mountain and waste your jinchi. It looks like after all these years your brain hasn't gotten any better." A short man with a broken sword and wretched clothes had killed his way up the endless stone steps and killed hundreds of tiger guards. In the entire world there was only Sigujien, who only cared about what was in front and not behind, who pressed forward with an indomitable sword intent, and who single-handedly protected Dongyi and the small vassal states for 20 years. No one dared to be disrespectful to Sigujien. Only the Qing Emperor dared to speak to him in such a tone. However, when these mocking words fell into the ears of those who paid attention, they heard a hint of being strong in appearance but weak in heart. No one dared to not reply to the Qing Emperor's question. However, Sigujien couldn't even be bothered to glance at the Qing Emperor. He only stared in a daze at old eunuch Hong beside the Emperor. Gradually, the great Grandmaster's gaze grew hot. It was as if they were going to pierce through the shadow under the straw hat and melt old eunuch Hong's old face. The short Sigujien opened his mouth. His voice was not like his body. It was as loud as a large bell. His voice could split pine, but it trembled with excitement. "It was you just now, wasn't it? What tyrannical jinchi." Sigujien stared at old eunuch Hong in a daze. "I know Fan Xian also walks this path. So you are his teacher. Speaking of which, the person who displayed power in the royal palace in Jingdo a dozen years ago was you. The rumors under heaven are indeed reasonable." The Qing Emperor was ignored by this great grandmaster. Although the Emperor did not get angry, his gaze gradually became icy. Looking at Sigujien he said, "You have tried to assassinate me 3 times. You didn't even see my face before retreating miserably. Is there some unexpected joy this time?" It seemed that Sigujien had only just heard the Qing Emperor's words. His gaze shifted slightly and looked at the Qing Emperor's face. After a moment of silence, he suddenly shook his head. "You are far less handsome than your son. What is there to look at?" The Emperor smiled slightly and said, "Naturally I am talking about Nji. Have you seen him?" Sigujien tilted his head and said, "I have a female disciple called LVCC. Her senior sister disciple was clearly killed by Fan Xian, but after seeing Fan Xian from afar in Hangzhou, she forgot her grudge and became infatuated. Every day she holds up some Bang Xian's high book and reads it. Speaking of which, Fan Xian, that pretty boy, is not bad." The sea breeze blew gently through the summit of the mountain. The Qing Emperor laughed loudly and said, "You Dongyi people are indeed all infatuated." Sigujien thought for a moment and then said seriously, "I am an idiot. My little disciple is even more of an idiot. My disciple is infatuated. This is as it should be." Then this seemingly idiotic great grandmaster suddenly gazed at the Qing Emperor and said, "I am not as good as you in governing and fighting wars. There are not many people more powerful than you in the world. Thus I must respect you. I hope you don't mind my rudeness just now. Sir is too polite." The Emperor seemed to be intoxicated and bowed slightly. Then the Emperor and Sigujien laughed loudly at the same time. Even the increasingly strong sea breeze could not stop the sound of the laughter from spreading. Sigujien's laughter was naturally imbued with extremely pure jinchi, so it broke through the wind without any hindrance. However, the Emperor's laughter was unhindered by the heroic spirit he had cultivated for a long time as the ruler of the world. The laughter suddenly stopped. An awkward silence fell. It was as if neither side knew how to continue this absurd play. To kill or to be killed, this was a question and not a long play that needed to be talked about, told history and told stories. Why had the Qing Emperor and Sigujien clumsily performed this scene earlier? The Qing Emperor slowly put his hands behind his back and sighed. He no longer looked at the 2 great grandmasters on the stone steps. Calmly he said, "I had followed Yunrui's intentions and followed her plan, intending to keep uncle here." Unexpectedly, Yunrui's plan was so crazy that she disregarded the safety of the country and tied Dongyi and northern Qi to her chariot. He turned his head without a trace of fear. Calmly, he looked at the shadow under Sigujien's straw hat and said, "Great grandmasters have not appeared in the world for a long time. When they do, they will shake the world. Since the 2 of you have come here today, naturally you must succeed. Although I am not afraid of death, I do not want to die. Thus I have no choice but to delay. I truly do not know why you are also delaying with me for so long. Sigujien was silent for a moment. His wrist dropped naturally. Appearing somewhat ill at ease, he smiled strangely and said, "Why am I so interested in this eunuch? Of the 4 strange creatures in the world, the 3 of us can all be considered divine friends. Only this eunuch likes to hide in the palace. It is because I understand Yi Luyun that I know his personality. If possible, he would act alone and not wait for us outsiders to interfere with the internal affairs of the Qing kingdom." Sigujien calmed down and respectfully said to old eunuch Hong, "Even if eunuch was here, Yi Luyun would still act." He said one last sentence to explain the Qing emperor's question. "Yi Luyun has his reasons for not acting. Thus, I can only see why he hasn't acted immediately." Yi Luyun smiled gently and turned his body to face Sigujien. "Foolish sword, do you still not feel it at this time?" Sigujien's body was short, so the straw hat on his head appeared particularly large. The shadow completely covered his face. Even though the shadow was heavy, the people on the summit seemed to see the trace of a bitter smile at the corners of this great grandmaster's lips and a strange expression on his face. Everyone's hearts jumped. They wondered what kind of discovery would make Sigujien, who had always viewed swords as an idiot and killed people like grass, quiet for so long. Sigujien turned and directly faced the door of the old temple behind everyone. He raised his sword and bowed. After a moment of silence he said, "I truly don't understand. Why have you come to join in on the lousy matters of the world?" The officials and priests who were seen by Sigujien were terrified and quickly moved away, terrified of being touched by his gaze. Following Sigujien's gaze, the people parted to make a path, revealing the black wooden door of the old temple at the very end. Outside the door was Wu Zhu, who was dressed entirely in black and seemed to have become one with the temple. Sigujien's gaze pierced through the air like 2 swords and landed on Wu Zhu's clean face and the black cloth that seemed to never be tainted by dust. However, Wu Zhu was unmoved and did not have any reaction. Sigujien sighed. The Qing emperor laughed again. This time his laughter was more natural. "If you can come, why can't Laowo?" The emperor's smile faded and he looked coldly at Sigujien. Yi Luyun smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said to Sigujien, "When the mountain was surrounded, Fan Xian was on the mountain. Naturally he also came." Sigujien paused. This great grandmaster had never cared about the specific process of surrounding the mountain. After pausing for a moment, he suddenly let loose a torrent of abuse. He completely disregarded a great grandmaster's aura and dignity. A string of curses went on for several breaths, using all the obscenities he could think of. *Sike. Yun Jilan and Yen Xiaoi, those 2 idiots. Why did they surround that pretty boy on the mountain? Sigujien scolded as he panted for breath. Are they trying to kill me? His expression suddenly froze. He looked coldly at the Qing emperor and mockingly said, "You brought Fan Xian up the mountain and found such a good helper. No wonder you're not afraid at all. Looks like I was wrong earlier. I'm not as good as you in governing and military. I am even less capable of squeezing my own children and family." The Qing emperor smiled slightly and didn't say anything. It was clear that, regardless of whether it was Sigujien or Yi Luyun, they both felt great shock and wariness toward Wu Zhu, who had suddenly appeared in the Qing temple at the summit of Dong Mountain. Although they were great grandmasters, past history and the miraculous happenings of this world had already proven many things. Otherwise, Sigujien would not have sent 13th Wang to Fan Xian's side and thrown out his last disciple, whose personality was most similar to his but was particularly gentle. Was it not because of this blind man? Sigujien suddenly looked at Wu Zhu and quietly said, "Don't get involved in this matter. Go down the mountain. This emperor is not a good person. Us old fellows will give you a guarantee. Fan Xian will live a glorious life. Even if he doesn't stay in the Qing kingdom and goes to Dongyi, I will have him be the master of the city." Everyone present remained silent, but expressions of shock and terror began to appear in their eyes. They didn't know who the black-clothed man standing at the temple door was to be able to make 2 great grandmasters stop in the instant before they assassinated the emperor and to make Sigujien, the always ruthless Sigujien, make such a large promise. No one would disbelieve the words of a great grandmaster. Thus, everyone was even more curious about the black-clothed man who was closely related to Sir Fan Jr. The emperor's brows furrowed slightly. He found that Wu Zhu had his head lowered as if thinking about something. Wu Zhu thought for a moment and then slowly said, "Apologies, Fan Xian asked me to protect the emperor's life." Like Yi Luyun, Sigujien also opened his mouth wide and sank into an expression of shock that was even greater than when he saw Wu Zhu. A moment later, he shook his head and said, "After 30 years, who would have thought you'd become so talkative? If I didn't know it was you, I would have thought you were being impersonated." Wu Zhu shook his head and couldn't be bothered to reply to such a senseless question. Sigu Jian adjusted the straw hat on his head and said, "Wu Zhu, we were friends back then. Unless I had no other choice, I didn't want to attack you. You have to know, in the 2 years after Nilan Mountain, I had tolerated Fan Xian for a long time." Everyone was shocked again and wondered what the friendship back then was. Wu Zhu was slightly startled. He thought for a moment and then quietly said, "At that time, your snot was on the ground. It was so dirty." Sigu Jian laughed loudly. "I'm just as dirty now. I'm still that idiot with a runny nose when I was a teenager. How about it? Do you want to squat with me again?" The corners of Wu Zhu's mouth twitched as if he wanted to smile. In the end he didn't. He only shook his head. Sigu Jian was silent for a long time. He then shook his head and put his sword back into the sheath by his side. Yi Luyun asked in surprise, "What?" Sigu Jian pointed at old eunuch Hong and Wu Zhu. He then looked at Yi Luyun and said without good humor, 2 against 2. Only an idiot would attack." Yi Luyun said with a pained expression, "But you, are you not an idiot?" "I am an idiot," Sigu Jian said seriously. "But I'm not crazy." Everyone present, including the Qing officials, priests and a few eunuchs, was actually seeing these legendary figures for the first time. They were seeing the great grandmasters who were like gods in the hearts of humans. After the initial respect and fear, countless absurd feelings grew in their hearts as they watched the conversation. Were these old men who bickered like children the great grandmasters who had secretly influenced the situation under heaven for 20 years? The emperor watched this scene and waited for the curtain to fall on the drama. His heart was calm. If Sigu Jian and Yi Luyun truly retreated, this drama would become a farce. Sigu Jian was not truly an idiot. He knew what terrifying consequences it would bring if he allowed the Qing emperor to return to Jingdou alive. Sigu Jian yelled at the top of his voice, "In any case, I won't fight 2 against 2. If that bastard still doesn't come out, I will immediately leave the mountain." Hearing these words, the emperor's pupils constricted slightly. His expression became cold. Clouds rose and fell at the waist of the mountain. Heavenly swords pierced through the stone paths. Fallen leaves drifted with the wind. The wind passed and the light scattered. In a flash, a third person wearing a straw hat floated to the top of the mountain like a fallen leaf. Kuhi had finally come. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.